Traffic surged through a crowded city intersection. A sudden, unpredictable impact killed the protagonist before they could react. In that final moment, memories flashed of his college assignments left unfinished, his best friend, a former employer from his part-time job, and the people from the orphanage who shaped his early years. And despite the struggles, life hadn't been all bad. In that instant, he still clung to life. As he stepped onto the crosswalk, a truck appeared out of nowhere and thundered toward him. Everything went black when he opened his eyes. Lying on the ground, bewildered, towering trees loomed above him. Clutching his chest and gasping for breath, he slowly rose. At first, he thought he had died, but there were no signs of the underworld he'd imagined. No river, no flower-strewn fields, only an endless forest. Hungry after his stomach growled, he grabbed a leaf and chewed it. Desperation drowned his hesitation, despite the awful taste, and he wondered why he was doing this. So hungry, he would eat leaves and afraid he might starve again, after having already died once. Driven by instinct, he began searching for something more substantial. A large insect crawled through the undergrowth and caught his eye. Picking up a stone, he struck the insect and ate it raw. It made him sick, but it was better than starving. He thought it might have been more bearable cooked. He rinsed his face in a nearby river. A faint sense of relief returned. The water rippled beneath him. A reflection that was not his own caught his eye. The face staring back was unfamiliar. Confusion rose. He had died and been reborn as someone else, like that common trope from Manga. He had been reborn in another world, or had taken over someone else's body. He fell to the ground. Perhaps he was only dreaming, lying unconscious in a hospital bed, recovering. And the truck hadn't hit him that hard. When the next day arrived, he knelt in the forest again. Nothing had changed. Reality had sunk in. He wasn't waking up. This was his life now. Resolved to survive, he began planning. If returning to Japan proved impossible, he would gather information, learn, and adapt. For now, staying alive was the only goal. Searching for food, he hoped to find signs of people or civilization. The forest was empty, and he walked alone. Living on insects, he suddenly heard a voice call to him and was surprised to realize that someone or something had spoken. A strange, bird-like creature appeared in front of him. Stunned. Instinctively, he said he was lost. The creature looked irritated and said the forest was its territory. It ordered him to leave. Fear hit him. Pleading, he said he wasn't worth eating, just skin and bones, after only eating a centipede the day before. The creature, unimpressed, said it had its own diet and would not eat him. The immediate danger passed, but the mystery of where he was and what he had become only deepened. It confronted him, demanding to know what he thought it was. Taken by surprise, the protagonist tried to calm the situation, stepped back, and began to leave. He turned and ran, his mind racing as he tried to figure out what had just happened. Thrown into a strange world, forced to survive on centipedes and trapped in a body that was not his, he now faced a griffin, and everything felt unreal, hostile, and overwhelming. Escape was all he wanted, but a griffin swooped down and blocked his path before he could get far. It let out a thunderous cry to show this was its territory. Even the deep jungle fell under its dominion. That pack had been established long ago. The griffin demanded to know how the protagonist dared to scavenge for food in its territory. The protagonist fell back in panic and tried to explain he had been lost. He didn't know the land belonged to the griffin, but the griffin called him a liar. The notice said humans and griffins had held a pact for over 2 centuries, a fact even children would know if the protagonist expected mercy. He would have to give a convincing reason that death was imminent. The protagonist decided to tell the truth, confessing to the griffin that he was inhabiting this body and did not come from this world. The protagonist watched the griffin react with surprise and ask for clarification, and in that moment, he grasped the full weight of his situation. He had truly died. On his knees, he said he knew nothing about this world or the body he now occupied, and could only plead for understanding. Though skeptical, the Griffin considered the confession and accepted that if the protagonist was a wanderer from another world, his ignorance made sense, so its voice softened and it offered an apology that surprised the protagonist. The creature accepted his fate, realizing how miserable it was to be thrown into such an unfamiliar place. The Griffin told him to accept this world. He could rescind his fate if necessary, but no amount of hatred would change it. The protagonist asked what a wanderer was, and the Griffin explained they were people from other worlds reborn here, but the protagonist clarified he had not been born here. Hearing the whole story, the Griffin grew interested. It said it had no knowledge of such a case. Wanderers had been seen 5 centuries earlier, but none were like this. The Griffin still concluded the protagonist was a wanderer, a strange kind of rebirth, and pointed out he now lived in a child's body, which implied he had once been an adult. The protagonist confirmed it, explaining he had been grown before, but was like this now, and asking whether that was a problem. The Griffin said the protagonist would be spared, but only on one condition. The protagonist must complete a task for the Griffin. Deep in the forest, a cave hid something unexpected. The protagonist followed the Griffin inside, unsure what lay ahead. As they stepped into the shadows, the cavern revealed a group of humans standing together, many of them children. The Griffin gestured toward the group as if expecting the protagonist to understand. About 30 children were gathered there. The mood was quiet and uncertain. The Griffin pointed out that they were the same race as the protagonist. The protagonist studied the scene, puzzled by so many young faces. A thought surfaced that the body he now inhabited might also have been abandoned because of famine. That fit its frail, starved condition. The Griffin confirmed humans had recently started leaving their children in the forest, and although it did not know why, it had happened often enough to become a pattern. The protagonist realized he was being asked to care for the children. The Griffin confirmed it firmly. He would watch over them until they could survive on their own. The protagonist paused to think, didn't dislike children, and having grown up in an orphanage, could understand them, but the situation felt overwhelming, so he asked if the main problem was not enough food. The Griffin promised food for 3 years, during which the children had to learn to fend for themselves. The announcement surprised him, because he had not expected such responsibility or generosity, and he realized the Griffin was not cruel, but acted out of duty and care. He clenched his fist as determination rose and still wondered why the Griffin had saved the children. The Griffin answered simply, "If you choose to save someone, you must see it through. Saving something only to abandon it was worse than doing nothing." The protagonist began to put the pieces together. The fruits in the Griffin's nest had been gathered and brought here for the children. Clearly the Griffin had taken them in, but did not know how to raise humans. That was likely why it sought help. The realization steadied him. He accepted the task and would take care of them because it was the right thing to do. He glanced at the children again, still unsure. He said he was their leader. The children stared at him, confused and silent. A critical detail hit him then, the language barrier. He asked the Griffin about the communication gap. The Griffin admitted the problem. It said people from other worlds could not understand the local language. It had nearly forgotten. Another question arose about how he could understand and speak with the Griffin. The answer was a divine gift called the blessing of the divine word. This blessing let its bearer communicate with other species. Stunned by a divine blessing, the protagonist listened as the Griffin offered to lend it to him temporarily. He stood speechless at how easily such power could be transferred. The Griffin said that normally divine blessings cannot be shared, but this one had a unique lending property. This allowed the griffin to temporarily grant one of its blessings to another person, and the protagonist worried this would inconvenience the griffin, but the griffin said it would not give away anything valuable and would only lend the divine blessing of language. This blessing changed both voice and hearing into another language so people could communicate across language barriers. It had limits and worked for only a certain number of languages. The protagonist asked how many divine blessings the griffin had in total, and the answer was 12. The number stunned him. 12. Glancing at one of the children, he wondered whether divine blessings were common, or this griffin was simply special, and whether people here could casually have multiple blessings. The griffin explained that although it had many blessings, not all were useful. The divine gift of language, for example, meant little to a griffin that could not use its voice properly. Now that gift would be tested when the protagonist spoke directly to the children. Turning to them, he surprised himself by speaking their language fluently, the words coming easily as he greeted the children politely, stunned that a foreign tongue now flowed from his mouth. A girl stepped forward and greeted him respectfully, wondering if she could call him Oni-chan. The protagonist was taken aback, but understood her completely. A boy then pointed at him and asked his name. The protagonist insisted the boy introduce himself first. The boy said his name was Ron, and that he was the group's leader. Then Ron, in a challenging tone, demanded the protagonist's name and told them to return. The protagonist paused, glanced at the griffin, and whispered for help, wanting a name that would fit this world. The griffin said Almas when asked what it meant. The griffin made the sound simply because it sounded nice, and that was reason enough. The protagonist introduced himself as Almas and greeted Ron politely. Ron looked suspicious and asked Almas his age. Almas said he was 20. Ron reacted with disbelief because Almas looked younger than him. The griffin confirmed that Almas was telling the truth, and Ron reluctantly accepted it. Almas then took charge and suggested everyone introduce themselves. Ron was 12. The girl from earlier introduced herself as Soin, Ron's childhood friend. Another boy said his name was Rosewood, and he was 11. Tetra arrived at age 10, followed by Graham, also 10, and then Lulu, also 10. Almas noticed that none of them looked younger than 9 years old. After introducing himself, Ron made it clear he did not yet accept Almas as their leader. Almas understood his skepticism. To the children, he was just a stranger who had suddenly appeared and claimed authority, and it reminded him of his days in the orphanage. Soyan Chandon tried to calm things down and reassured Almas that Ron wasn't a bad person, just a bit stupid. Offended, Ron asked what she was doing and who she was calling stupid. Soyan answered matter-of-factly that it was the truth. Ron shot back, calling her stupid for calling him stupid. They began bickering. He watched them briefly, noticing that despite being abandoned, the children were lively, even spirited. He knew deep down they were hurting. Beneath the noise and mischief, wounds remained. Almas stepped forward with resolve and vowed to protect them all. Tetra watched him quietly from the group. Ron scoffed at Almas's declaration and demanded to know his plan as their self-proclaimed leader. Almas answered confidently that their first step would be agriculture. A child stared in disbelief when Almas mentioned farming. Almas's memory was faint, but he remembered a few things about farming and insisted they had no other option. The griffin's support would last only 3 years. After that, the 31 would have to support themselves. There was simply no other way. Ron raised a concern. Farming did not seem possible for them, and they had no idea how to begin. They almost admitted Ron had a point. Their situation was far from ideal. Deep in the jungle, surrounded by dense forest, The land was not ready for planting yet. First, they would have to clear the area by cutting trees and removing roots. Only then would the soil be soft enough to cultivate. There was a deeper problem. These were all children, and very few could even swing a pickaxe. Rose voiced what many were thinking. They were trapped, and giving up seemed easier. He turned to Tetra for agreement. The griffin, listening from above, cut in sharply and said giving up was not an option. Soine, trying to grasp the idea, wanted to know what farming involved. Alma said they would need iron tools to start, which would make the work manageable. Ron asked how to get them. Alma answered one word: trade. Ron looked doubtful because all their valuables were gone, eaten or broken by the children, but Alma smiled and said that by some stroke of luck, a few objects still remained, though they could not be eaten. The griffin returned, carrying a pile of swords, apologized for the delay, seemed genuinely surprised at how quickly it had acted, and he thanked it, realizing they now had something valuable to work with. Ron and Rosewood stared in awe at real swords, and quickly understood these were the weapons of people who once tried to subdue the griffin. Many failed challengers had left their gear, and the griffin had scavenged it over time, far more than they expected. The griffin said the scattered items annoyed it, and asked them to wait, because it still had more to collect. To the griffin, this was simply clearing out unburnable trash. Tetra asked Almas if he planned to trade the weapons for farming tools. Almas confirmed warmly, and trying to praise her, reached to pat her head, but she almost slapped his hand away. Ron argued they should trade the swords for food, but Soyen said that once the food ran out, they'd eat grass, and Ron backed down with a resigned groan as Soyen asked whether all they had to do was till the ground. Almas said finding suitable soil was crucial. If they could not handle it themselves, they would have to hire adults, and using the swords as payment might keep them from ending up in dangerous hands. In the back of his mind, he was confident that if anything went wrong, the griffin would protect them. They faced the practical problem of where they could trade the sorts and whether anyone had experience. The children looked downcast. The girls looked apologetic. Ron admitted he did not know, and others echoed him. And an annoyed Rosewood said he would rather die than say anything, which made it nearly clear that Rosewood did not know either. All eyes turned to Tetra, who stepped forward, said she didn't know, pulled out a rough map, and began to explain that they were in the Ramalia jungle, with the Rose Ice Kingdom to the east, the Gilded Kingdom to the northwest, the Demerga Kingdom to the northeast, and the Fall Dam Kingdom further north. Tetra drew on the dirt with a stone and added detail. Rosai's was bad at making iron tools. Demerga and Gilbed took advantage of the famine to attack Faldam. Alma saw an opening. With the weapons they had now, they could sell them for a high price. This was their chance. He asked Tetra how she knew so much. Her answer was sobering. If the adults from those lands learned the children had the weapons, they would likely take them back by force. He replied confidently that he had already thought it through, and to show he could trade weapons without being robbed or dismissed, he produced one large, striking feather, unmistakably from the griffin. Ron and Rosewood stared at it in disbelief. It was a feather from Griffin Summer himself. Almost pointed out that if they showed this to the adults and said they were following the griffin's orders, no one would dare refuse them. It would be undeniable proof and protection. Still, Almost made a note to ask the griffin directly for full permission. Rosewood felt uneasy. The idea of invoking the griffin's name felt intimidating and made it clear not all of them should go to the market. They needed a small team, so volunteers were asked. And Rosewood and Soyan raised their hands right away and then picked Tetra to join, despite her not volunteering. Tetra protested, but accepted that her knowledge of the region and quick mind made her indispensable, sighed, with her eyes closed, and offered no further objection. The next day, the group entered a busy marketplace in Demerga's territory. Almas and the children spread their weapons out before a row of vendors. With a confident expression, he almost began negotiating for 10 steel swords and 6 bronze swords, asked if they were tradable, while an elderly merchant leaned forward to inspect the weapons and note their quality and origin. He asked whether they were messengers of the griffin before Almas could answer, while other vendors approached and told the elder that the local smith had arrived. After giving instructions, the elder turned back to the group and quietly admired the weapons. Each blade was expertly made. He asked what they hoped to trade for. Almas and the children brightened with excitement, all except Tetra, who remained neutral. He relayed the request: 10 iron pickaxes, 3 hatchets, and 8 sickles. Returning through this forest, Ron was amazed they had traded those swords for so many tools, despite iron being so valuable, and Soyan worried they might have undersold. Tetra agreed that since the weapons were iron, they could have asked for more. Almost replied calmly that starting with a modest price was a negotiation tactic. It helped build rapport and left room for future trades. He said they'd come back for more later, but doubts remained, and many wondered if children could really reclaim and farm the land. Farming alone would not sustain them, so they would also need to hunt, forage, and fish. The griffin was already supplying meat and leather to sell, but they still had to decide where to start farming and whether cutting trees would anger the griffin. Almas laid out his entire plan to the griffin, who listened and said there was no problem. Its protected territory lay deep within a jungle. Outside that, Almas could proceed as he saw fit. The griffin then recalled that 30 years ago, people had lived in that area. The settlement was abandoned after an epidemic. Locals had mistakenly believed the griffin had cursed the land. It was such a waste. Almas was stunned, wondered why the griffin had not mentioned this sooner, and asked where the old village was located. The griffin admitted it had been so long, it no longer remembered the exact spot. It had an idea and told Almas to climb on. From the air, they could spot the ruins more easily. Almas, still unsure, asked what going above the ground meant. Before he could finish speaking, the griffin suddenly launched into the sky and he clung tightly to its back in terror. He protested that they should just give up. The griffin scolded him for grabbing things at random. He almost asked what would happen if he needed to relieve himself. The griffin replied flatly that if he did, it would throw him off. Mid-flight, the griffin spotted something ahead. At full speed, it turned toward it. Wings cut through the air. Far below, a forgotten village slowly came into view with collapsed buildings, broken walls, and silent, lifeless streets. The griffin dove and landed in a clearing among the ruins. Almas stumbled as he dismounted, his legs trembling beneath him. The griffin said it would be far more efficient to use what nature had already provided than to try to reclaim land from scratch. Almas agreed and asked permission to explore the area. Stepping into the crumbled remains of the abandoned village, he walked among shattered stone walls and collapsed wooden beams. Amid the rubble, he found a narrow stream and knelt beside it. The water ran clear and looked safe to drink. He scanned the remnants of a nearby house, which might still serve as shelter despite being weathered and broken, and not necessarily beyond repair. Continuing his inspection, he examined a piece of discarded furniture. It was broken, but still had some shape. If fixed, they could live here for a while. Stepping outside, he noticed a wide field where tall grasses swayed in the breeze, and dense trees formed its border. Crouching, he ran his fingers through the grass. The space seemed more than adequate. It would need clearing, but it could definitely be used for farming. Everything about the terrain, the water, and the shelter exceeded expectations. Almas returned to the griffin and thanked it. The place was far better than he had imagined. The griffin replied indifferently that it had not created the land. Still curious, Almas asked the griffin to tell him more about the disaster that had driven people away, asking specifically about the famine. The griffin said plainly that the harvest had failed. Human interference may have caused it. A curse, perhaps. Almas was startled. Uncertain what the griffin had encountered, he found it hard to believe a curse could be real. The griffin spoke bluntly that curses existed in this world. Almas's expression showed he did not understand. Almas demanded proof. The griffin answered cryptically, saying the way something is described can be evidence in itself. Almas recalled the world was under divine protection, so it stood to reason it would harbor powerful magic, including curses. He still wondered why someone would go so far. The griffin replied coldly that humans were a violent species who killed their own kind with natural ease. He almost accepted that quietly, even with fertile land, clean water, and a place to live. None of it would matter if another curse struck them. They would die anyway. The griffin assured him that no one would lay a hand on the jungle. No sorcerer could match its power, and curses that strong were hard to cast and took time to prepare. Almas agreed and said he would call the children now. The griffin looked up at the sky. The sun was already beginning to set. He suggested they wait until tomorrow. Then he told Almas to get on his back. Almas groaned at the idea. The griffin launched into the sky again. Almas held on tight as the wind roared in his ears while they soared high above the forest. The next day, Almas gathered the children and announced they had found a new home. The children stared in awe, overwhelmed by the news. Ron asked what they would do first, then repeated the question with a slight smirk, calling Almas leader without fully admitting it, and sounding only partly convinced, while Soyan teased him from behind, urging him to be more honest about his feelings. Ron grumbled and chased after her in frustration. Tetra stood quietly beside Almas. Before he arrived, she said they had been a cluster of lost children. No ideas ever stuck, and no plan ever moved forward. Everyone was consumed by memories of their parents. Even small things like Ron and Rosewood arguing had once seemed overwhelming, but now everything was different. Almas looked at her and said he had once been like her. At that moment, Ron turned back and called out, asking what their first lesson would be. Almas smiled quietly and said they would begin with crop rotation. The children looked confused by the term crop rotation. Ron misread it and got excited because it sounded like something delicious. Soen, unimpressed, teased that Ron only ever thought about food and nearly began to explain. The plan was to rotate crops over a 4-year cycle, barley to clover, clover to wheat. Ron felt confused. It seemed unnecessarily complicated. It almost made sense. If they kept growing the same crop on the same land, the soil would lose nutrients and become infertile. Clover helps restore those nutrients and fertilize the soil. Raising livestock alongside crops let them collect the animals' waste and turn it into manure to enrich the soil, so the system supported itself with soil and animals in a continuous loop. That was crop rotation. It might seem like magic, but it was not, and it had downsides. He pointed out that dividing the land into 4 parts to rotate crops would reduce crop yields by 2 to 3 times during the rotation cycle, and raising cattle could offset that loss while adding other benefits, but they first had to obtain cattle. Visibly overwhelmed, Rosewood admitted he did not understand what Almas meant. Almas explained it simply. All Rosewood needed to know was that crop rotation was more productive in the long run. With that, Almas announced their first priority. They repaired the houses while the weather stayed kind to them. United, the children patched broken walls and rebuilt what they could. Piece by piece, the ruined village began to look livable again. That night, they sat in a circle around a bonfire, the flickering flames reflecting in their eyes. The next day, Tetra almost asked what he planned to do with the place. Almost said he was thinking about raising goats. Goats were hardy animals that could survive on bark and were not picky about food. Even children could raise them. They were not suited for labor, but were easy to manage. Ideally, he would choose cows or horses, animals that could work and provide meat, but he had no experience with them, whereas he knew goats from the orphanage farm, where he helped raise goats and cattle and got some of the farm's products in return. Tetra admitted she didn't know much about crop rotation. It didn't feel necessary right now and seemed like too much trouble. She almost said goat milk tasted awful, but admitted it was full of nutrients. The nutrients missing from the griffin's meat-based diet included calcium, and an imbalanced diet, especially for growing children, could cause long-term health problems, while Tetra, still processing, looked confused and almost asked if she understood. Tetra said she understood Almas was worried about them. Almas did not answer directly. He scratched his head and looked a little embarrassed. In another part of the village, someone suggested exchanging cattle. Soyan turned to Tetra and asked how the trade could work, saying they were in a famine and the other kingdom would refuse. And Tetra explained the Rao-size kingdom desperately needed weapons and would have to accept, while someone inside looked out the window and saw the kingdom was too far away. So transporting goats would be a nightmare unless the griffin helped. Outside, the griffin loomed over a herd of goats, threatening to kill any that tried to run. Ron watched in awe from behind. That was Griffin's Summer, who could speak the goat's language. Rosewood, less amused, muttered that even if the griffin was only trying to control them, threatening goats was still cruel. Elsewhere, children were already chasing the goats around the village, shouting when they heard them. Almas was carrying a bow. While negotiating for goats, he saw bows and arrows that fit the children and brought back a few because they could be useful for hunting. He aimed and fired at the target, but missed again. Ron laughed and called it Alma's 10th failure. Alma, flustered and angry, shoved the bow into his hands and told him to prove he could do better. Ron pulled the string and released the arrow, but it wobbled and fell to the ground. I almost laughed, teasing him for failing just as badly. Throwing up his hands, he said neither of them could do it, and that he had no idea how they were supposed to hunt or what they were going to do, and Ron snapped back, calling Almas sarcastic and saying he wasn't acting like an adult, while Almas fired back that he was still a kid, and Ron replied that if he wanted to be taken seriously, he should at least act like a grown-up. While the argument continued, a nearby child spoke up timidly and suggested Graham try it. Almas and Ron turned to him, surprised. Graham seemed unlikely. Almas was skeptical. If Ron could not do it, the problem had to be the bow itself. It was probably a cheap knockoff. He joked that it might even be made in China. Silently, Graham stepped forward, picked up the bow, and drew it confidently. She released the arrow, and it flew straight, landing just short of the bull's eye. The children fell silent. Ron stood slack-jawed and muttered that they must be kidding him. Graham shot again and hit the target, surprising everyone with her accuracy. Soyan suggested one more try, and Graham reluctantly agreed, drew her bow, and released another arrow that landed near the bull's eye again. It became clear this was not luck. Almost everyone noticed she hit the target twice, and Ron admitted such precision could not be coincidence. The other children, excited, asked Graham to teach them. Graham began, by giving instructions on posture. They needed to stretch their backs properly. Later, Swayan almost placed a hand on Graham's shoulder, and Graham reminded her that in 3 years, the griffin would stop providing support. After that, the burden of hunting would fall on her, and she needed to prepare. And Swayan added that in the end, only Graham could hit the bullseye. Worried about leaving hunting to Graham alone, Ron spoke up. Another child pointed out they only had one bow, then nearly opened a pouch he'd brought and told Ron not to worry. Ron had already thought of that and showed them what was inside. This is a sling for throwing stones. Swayan inspected it and asked what it was. I'll explain how to use it. One hand holds the end of one cord. The stone is placed inside, and the other cord is held in the opposite hand. Then the user spins the sling to the right speed, releases one end, and launches the stone hard so it nearly hits the target. He told the children that with proper training, they could learn to hit birds. And it was a practical solution because slings were easy to make, stones were everywhere, and every child could be given one. Later, they ventured into the mountains, and the griffin accompanied them, pointing out edible and poisonous plants and explaining that one type of leaf could cause stomach pain unless it was soaked in water to neutralize the toxin. Almost admired the griffin, noting he did not eat only meat, but also ate vegetables, and said the griffin must be omnivorous since he was half beast and half bird, which made sense. Seeing a bird eat meat still felt odd to him, and he nearly wondered if the griffin was more bird or more mammal as they kept forging, and he almost asked about a certain mushroom. The griffin said he could eat it with no problem, but a human like Almas would die instantly from it. And later, Almas thanked the griffin for his help. The griffin gave a brief reply that he had to return to his territory. Already sleepy, he rose into the sky and seemed to wave as he vanished overhead. Nearly reflected. Agriculture, dairy, butter, hunting, and livestock were all vital, and harvesting was equally important. Fortunately, the griffin taught the children which plants were edible and which were not, so they could proceed with greater confidence. Walking alone in the jungle, I suddenly heard a distant shout. He froze, then ran toward the sound. He recognized the voice in his mind as Rosewood and gripped the hilt of his sword, bracing himself. A small animal he could lure away, but a larger or dangerous one meant he had to be clever and find a way to rescue Rosewood. He hoped Rosewood was unharmed. Deep in the woods, Rosewood fought a man's grip, while the man barked at him to stay still. Rosewood shouted back defiantly that the man was wasting his time. His parents had abandoned him. He was worthless to them, hiding in the underbrush, and almost saw the scene, where a man, clearly human, was holding Rosewood, and he nearly overheard Rosewood shouting that he could not be traded for food. I almost recognized him immediately. The bald man sneered and said he already knew, but Rosewood had many steel swords, and that was his real target, not food. Though clearly stronger and an adult, the opponent was only an ordinary man. Almost noticed that Rosewood looked uninjured and the man was alone. Crucially, the man's back was exposed and his weapon was almost quietly ready. Before anything else, he decided to throw a stone first. A stone flew through the air and hit the bald man squarely in the neck with a dull, heavy thud. Immediately, the grip on Rosewood loosened, and Almas. Without hesitation, Rosewood was told to flee, but they hesitated for a second, unsure whether to leave the Almas behind. He finally obeyed and ran, leaving almost standing alone against the man. The bald man recovered, rubbed the spot where he had been struck, fixed a sharp glare on Almas, then picked up his weapon and taunted that Almas was protecting the child. Sneering at Almas, he mocked him as a cute little kid who would regret this. Calmly, Almas asked the man what his goal was. The man answered bluntly that he wanted the types of steel. Pressing for more, Almas asked, Then what? The man said he planned to trade them for food, saying farming wasn't his thing. He took a breath and said it was a relief. The bald man scoffed, puzzled by the remark, almost drew his sword, moved in quickly, and struck with precision, stabbing the man in the side. The man staggered while trying to block, but his weapon broke on impact. Collapsing to the ground, he rolled onto his side in pain, almost wasn't finished, gripping the man's back tightly. Almas shifted position and stabbed him again. The man begged for his life, but Almas did not waver. He drove the blade deeper. Blood poured from the man's mouth. Through clenched teeth, Almas whispered a single word, "Die." Kneeling beside the motionless body, Almas stayed still, staring at the corpse in the man's outstretched hand, pale and lifeless, while his chest rose and fell fast as the realization of what he'd done sank in. He muttered that it was the only way. If the man had succeeded, today others would follow, and letting him go would put everyone at greater risk. He told himself the man had to die here. There was no other choice. His hands trembled under the weight of what he'd done, and the idea of protecting the village echoed in his head, but did not erase the shock of having killed someone. Suddenly, he almost collapsed beside the dead man. His stomach turned and he vomited on the ground. Children rushed toward him. Some called his name and others asked if he was all right. Almas, too tired to answer, wiped his mouth and stared at the dirt. Rose reached him first and gripped his shoulder hard. His voice shook with panic as he called to Almas over and over. Almas, still pale and shaken, assured him that he was fine. A faint, tired smile followed as he tried to comfort Rosewood, despite his own distress. Near tears, Rosewood said he had been terrified that Almas might have died because of him. Almas stopped him, gently patting his head, apologized, and said he was not used to this. Ron and Graham joined them soon, standing quietly nearby as the weight of the situation settled over everyone. Later, deep in the forest, he almost told the griffin about the incident. The griffin listened calmly and said that was what had happened. A hard thing, but not something to dwell on. He explained it wasn't just humans who killed each other. Ants did it too. If he could think of it as done for survival, just for food, maybe it would bother him less. He almost nodded and said he understood the griffin's point, but admitted it was still hard to see it that way. The griffin said that for social creatures like them, killing another would naturally feel wrong. Still, protecting the children felt like a duty, and returning them safely to their settlement was part of that responsibility. There was no shame in what he did, and the griffin tilted his head as if to ask whether Almas had come only to report that, and Almas, caught off guard, answered awkwardly that there was something else, holding out a piece of broken wood for the griffin to see. Almas snapped the wood with his hands, splintering it into fragments. The griffin looked at him, puzzled, and asked what he had done. Almas replied awkwardly, unsure how to explain further. The griffin remembered something and thought it odd that a 10-year-old could have so much strength, then said he knew of a human-like race that could split trees with their bare hands. The griffin said they were not actually human, which sent a chill through Almost and left him unnerved, but the griffin reassured him those beings had vanished from the world about 3,000 years ago, and Almost relieved, muttered how fortunate that was. The griffin looked back and asked if Almas was impressed by his own strength. Almas said he wasn't impressed that way. Almas simply didn't understand why he suddenly had such power. The griffin said Almas probably didn't know his own body that well. Even if he guessed, it might just be a blessing. And as a wanderer, a junior's remark could have brought him here and given him 1 or 2 blessings along the way. Almas looked puzzled and asked what exactly Junior's remark meant. The griffin dodged the question, saying it was better Almas did not know. Changing the subject, the griffin asked if there was anything else. Almas said the conversation had already given him far too much to think about, and he prefers some time alone to process it. Half a month later, the village was fully rebuilt. The once empty fields now held neat rows of radishes, and the children worked quietly under the sun, tending their crops, almost looked on with satisfaction. The vegetables were doing well, and he was grateful he had managed to trade for radish seeds. Even more fortunate, the radishes were identical to those from his old world. The only downside was a labor shortage. They did not have enough hands, so production stayed small scale. Just as things seemed to be going well, Tetra gave a sudden distressed sob when she spotted worms among the plants. Ron called everyone over after finding another. Rosewood, equally disgusted, pointed out even more and said that without pesticides, the jungle's pests were taking their toll. He almost examined a nearby flower and called the others over to see it. When Soen asked what it was, Ron said it looked like a pyrethrum daisy, a type of daisy used to repel pests. They had almost found a whole patch of daisies known as a natural ingredient in mosquito coils, and distilled extract could be used to protect their crops. Tetra approved and grew enthusiastic, saying they should start collecting the flowers immediately. Almas handed her a bunch. She was taken aback by the sudden gesture and unsure of its intent, so he smirked knowingly, while Almas remained oblivious. Soyan told Tetra that Almas only wanted her to hold the bouquet, nothing more. Tetra reacted awkwardly by throwing the flowers into the air, scattering the petals without explanation, and Almas still did not understand what had happened. Later, he almost stood before a huge pot where the distillation was taking place. The children gathered around as he stirred the daisies in boiling water, and he wondered aloud whether admitting uncertainty would be effective, why the pests would die from the concoction, and whether it was magic. He explained that the reaction came from the flower's natural toxicity. The children looked startled and uneasy, but his explanation nearly reassured them. And the plant is harmless to humans in small doses, but could be dangerous in large amounts. When the distillation finished, Almost told the children to start applying it to the fields. They eagerly poured the liquid onto the plants, determined to protect their crops. With the crops protected and basic needs like food and shelter covered, Almas said they only needed to buy items not found in the forest. Soyan asked what items he meant, and Almas replied, clothing and certain foods that didn't exist in the wild, adding someone had to stay and guard the village when others went out, so he chose Graham for the task, and she was shocked and protested, but Almas said she could use a bow and arrows, so she was the most suitable. She said nothing more, then almost selected Ron and Rosewood as carriers. Both boys looked proud and eager. He turned to Tetra and asked if she wanted to come along. When Tetra asked where they were going, he almost told her they were headed to Rossi's. After a short silence, Tetris turned away and said she wouldn't be joining them. In Rossi's, the grand capital, the children walked through the towering main gate into a city buzzing with energy and splendor. After their long journey, they were overwhelmed by the city's vast size and bright lights. Streets were crowded with people and buildings towered overhead. The city's energy was unlike anything they'd ever experienced. Walking down the crowded street, Almas felt quietly amazed. He had not seen so many people in one place in a long time, and the city was more beautiful than he had imagined. The buildings, the crowds, and the smells created a sensory storm. Ron's voice cut through the noise when he spotted a food vendor, and he brightened. A large chef stirred a massive pot, steam rising with a savory scent. Almas sniffed and he agreed that it smelled incredible. Rosewood, not wanting to be left out, suddenly tugged Alma along and shouted about a nearby store, pointing to a tailor shop. Rosewood looked genuinely surprised and even amused to see a man sewing cloth. He kept pulling Almas along, telling him to follow and look around. Almas looked overwhelmed, sweat gathering on his brow. Rosewood and Ron stared at him eagerly, unable to contain their energy. Almas composed himself and told them not to drag him around like that. Getting excited was fine, he said, but there should be some respect toward their seniors. In the middle of the busy street, Almas redirected their focus. First, they needed money. Without it, none of this mattered. Finding a place that would accept their goods took time. Eventually, they found a vendor in a corner stall, approached and asked if there was a nearby place to trade animal teeth and herbs. The vendor pointed them to a nearby building. They entered a dimly lit room that smelled of dry wood and dust. An elderly man greeted them, and his eyes widened when Almas presented the animal teeth. With a strange motion of his hand, he inspected them and showed surprise at their quality. He murmured his approval and offered an extra roll of karmic cloth for the batch. He almost accepted the deal, pleased with the trade, and handed over the herbs he'd brought. But just as the transaction was going smoothly, a girl appeared suddenly, full of energy and curiosity, and when she saw the herbs, she gasped in recognition and said, "Caramel grass," completely fascinated. I was nearly caught off guard by her enthusiasm. The old man introduced her respectfully as Yuria-sama. Locking her gaze on Almas, she asked eagerly for his name. Still a little shy and surprised, Almas introduced himself, and Yuria looked at the herbs and said she would buy them, adding she would not take them for free, which amused him and made him think she was sincere. Offering 1 gold coin, he watched her agree without hesitation and placed the coin in his hand. Almas asked what she intended to use the herb for. She said frankly she would mix it with marijuana to make a strong drug. The answer stunned him, and he was inwardly baffled, wondering if she had been raised to speak that way. And even with translation smoothing, he could not believe what she had said. Yuria called him Almas Cohen, but he corrected her politely and said, "Just Almas." And she smiled and told him to do the same. No honorifics, just Yuria, since they were the same age. Noticing the children behind him, she asked who they were. So Ron took Rosewood by the shoulder and introduced them both, immediately assuming she was rich. And Rosewood introduced himself too, but kept thinking she was a drug manufacturer. Yuria turned back to Almas and asked where he came from, and he said he lived in a village about a day's journey away, so she immediately connected that to the Ramaya forest, noted the caramel grass he carried was very valuable, and asked him to show where he had gathered so much. Almas asked what he'd get in return. Yuria, amused by his sharpness, laughed and offered a deal. Almas agreed to bring caramel grass to her once a month in return for 1 gold coin each time. Almas accepted happily, and they shook hands to seal the agreement. Yuria reminded him they would meet there each month for the exchange. Before she left, she said she'd have to return soon or her father would scold her, and held Almas's hand as she said goodbye. She stepped closer, made a cryptic remark that he had received a blessing, then waved and left, after reminding him of their arrangement, and he stood frozen, trying to process her words while wondering if she had really said blessing. Back in the village, Tetra sat across from Almas with a serious look. She asked him to say good morning without using the divine blessing of language. Almas tried, but his words came out jumbled. He knew he was trying to learn the language of that world, but his pronunciation was still off. Tetra corrected him and told him again it was wrong. He often thought that because the griffin had lent him the divine gift of language, It would not belong to him forever, and one day he would have to return it. If that happened suddenly, he would lose his ability to communicate. That was a troubling thought. He asked Tetra to describe the world they lived in, and she hesitated. Explaining, she said they lived on the Adelia Peninsula, about half of which belonged to the Rose's kingdom, the southern tip jutting into the ocean being the Carizio region, and she added that she could also speak the Carizian language. Almas was impressed that Tetra was bilingual. Tetra said the Rose-size kingdom and the Demoral kingdom shared the same royal name. It was only a political convenience, not real unity. The kingdoms merely cooperated under a common title. On a calm day, Almas asked Tetra if she could write. She said she could, and Almas said that when he remembered more words, he wanted her to teach him to write them. Tetra replied, unexpectedly, that Adelia had no writing system. Almas was surprised and asked for clarification. She confirmed she only wrote in Carithian and asked that once he learned Adelian properly, she would teach him Carithian. Tetra gave him a thoughtful look and agreed. As she helped him day after day, he almost felt she had done so much for him. He should give something in return. He asked how far she could count, and she said up to 10,000. When he asked what calculations she could do, she said basic addition and subtraction with two-digit numbers, and he almost wondered whether Tetra was the only one capable. The next day, Almas told the children they would learn addition, and Lulu looked shocked, raised her hand to ask a question, and almost nodded toward Almas in curiosity. Lulu asked bluntly whether learning that would help them. At the back of the group, Ron and Rosewood loudly protested, saying it would be a waste of time. He nearly answered the objection, addressing everyone and saying it was a good question while clarifying his reasoning. They could not focus only on farming. They needed to be able to trade goods for money, and without basic calculation, traders could easily deceive them. Pointing it out to Ron and Rosewood, he got them to admit he was right and to confess they had been tricked in a past trade because they did not know how to calculate their change. He nearly told everyone that basic calculation skills could let them run a shop someday and open many new paths in life. Then he called on Tetra and asked her to count from 1 to 10. She paused and began counting, and after she finished, I almost told her she'd forgotten 0. Tetra looked shocked. 0 was unfamiliar to her. He almost thought himself lucky that this world used a base 10 number system, but they had no concept of 0, so he drew a circle to show nothing, introduced the idea of 0, and later taught them Arabic numerals. He called them numbers that would make calculations far more efficient and considered them one of humanity's top 10 inventions. Tetra, who could previously count up to 10,000, complained that it was too complicated. He almost smiled and assured her that once she became used to it, she would find it enjoyable. The next day, Tetra sat beside Almas, holding a wooden slate with pride. She beamed with satisfaction as she showed him all the completed problems. He was almost surprised at how quickly she solved them. By then, a full month had passed since he began teaching the children arithmetic. He created a ranking system where higher scorers were assigned to teach lower scorers. Unsurprisingly, Tetra ranked first and took on the task of helping everyone. Outside, Almas and Tetra discussed Tetra's role teaching the others, and Tetra said it was unfair to teach without getting anything in return, since she had already taught in Adelian and Carizian, so she demanded they teach her algebra next. Almas agreed and gave her a special privilege. Inside the house, Tetra sat in front of him and listened closely as Almas checked her work. Almas confirmed her answers were all correct and said she was now proficient in 3-digit addition and subtraction. Almas then proposed trying something new. Tetra said it would be 4-digit numbers next and that there should not be much difference. Almas then moved on to multiplication. Curious, Tetra asked if everyone in Almas's homeland could do calculations like that, and Almas said even young children could, but he believed Tetra was better because she had learned everything from scratch and, using Arabic numerals, had in some ways surpassed them. So Tetra, sensing his genuine praise, smiled and asked whether he was paying her a compliment, almost rubbed her head gently, confirming it without words. Tetra then asked why everyone in his country could learn it, almost explained that in his homeland, education was a responsibility. It was a right for every citizen and was considered essential. To him, knowledge was as valuable as gold, but keeping it to oneself only helped the privileged. Without sharing, a country could not grow or compete with others. He asked Tetra if she did not want to raise other children as intelligent as she was. He reminded her that adults had a duty to do what was best for the next generation. Tetra asked whether the role of caring for others was complicated and almost admitted it was. She steered the conversation back to languages and asked when Almas would become fluent. Almas said it would take a long time because she already knew that mastering a language was not easy. Tetra asked what would happen if he ever lost the divine blessing of language, almost replied that he would no longer be able to teach her math, and Tetra answered urgently. He insisted he could never afford to lose it. Yuria agreed with Almas, noting it had been some time since their last meeting. Then she asked if he had brought what they had agreed on, and Almas held out the bundle of caramel grass to fulfill his part. As Yuria handed him a gold coin in return, she casually asked where Ron and Rose were and almost added that they had stayed behind in the village. He then said there was something he wanted to talk about. Yuria immediately knew it was about his blessing. She said she had expected that because he had been curious about it for the past month, and almost admitted he wanted to learn more if possible. Yuria admitted she did not know everything, but based on books and old records, she said blessings were believed to come from kind fairies, and though he found that idea a bit fanciful, she brushed off his doubt and said the reason she could identify his blessing was simple. Her blessing let her see other people's blessings. The ability was called the see-through blessing. Then she revealed what she had seen, nearly receiving the king's blessing, and explained further. As more people genuinely saw Almas as their leader, his abilities would grow stronger. Almas absorbed the explanation and paused in silence, realizing that with the king's blessing, the children's acceptance of him was the source of his growing strength and ability. Yuria confirmed what he was thinking, then asked him something else. He did not fear the griffin's curse, even though he lived in the Ramalahia forest. Almas, caught off guard, asked how she knew about that. Yuria said another of her blessings, Heaven's Eye, let her see distant places. After seeing him and the children enter the forest, she assumed they were living there. She asked if he had done anything to avoid the griffin's curse and wanted him to explain how. He almost said there was no curse at all. Believing it would not hurt to tell Yuria that, he kept his reincarnation a secret. Yuria nodded thoughtfully and said the children with him had been abandoned. Almas said nothing, and Yuria promised she would tell no one and keep it private. He thanked her. Yuria then invited him to go with her to buy something. He almost agreed, seeing her as an important customer. When they reached the market, Almas looked stunned at how much shopping she was doing. Eventually, he carried many bags filled with various items. Yuria kept adding more items, telling Almas to be a man and keep up. Exhausted, Almas muttered that he was a man, but she should not treat him like her personal porter. A nearby vendor watched in disbelief at how easily he carried the heavy load, wondering how strong the young man was. Curious, Almas asked Yuria about the strange herbs and rocks she had bought. Yuria replied casually that they were for practicing hoodoo. Nearly taken aback, he asked if she meant those ominous-sounding spells. Yuria cleared up the misunderstanding. It wasn't only about curses. It included a wide range of magical practices like creating protective barriers, breaking curses, and making medicines. It was a recognized profession among humans. To Almas, it sounded like a kind of doctor by modern Japanese standards, and he realized Yuria, with her abilities and knowledge, could have considerable reputation and status in this world. The thought made him remember the griffin's claim that humans caused the famine, so he almost asked Yuria what she thought, and she said that, based on what people were saying, it was a curse likely cast by a group of powerful witches. Almos asked who would do such a thing and wondered what kind of person would inflict a curse on such a massive scale. Yuria corrected him, saying it was not a single person, but a nation, and a curse on that scale could easily cause thousands of deaths. She assured Almas she would not hold back next time against those responsible, which surprised him, and he asked Yuria if she would like to visit Romalia with him someday. Excitement lit her eyes, but she said she needed to talk to her father first because he might not let her leave the city. Almas also suggested that Yuria learn hoodoo from her, and Yuria was surprised by the request. He paused, thought, then almost offered to pay for the lessons, but Yuria refused, saying no money was needed. They were friends. Her words nearly caught him off guard. He asked whether she really considered them friends. Yuria returned the question, asking whether they were not friends. Almost agreed. They must have been in agreement, because otherwise he would not have carried all her shopping. Still curious, he almost asked why she thought he couldn't learn hoodoo. Yuria said she could teach him, but he wasn't suited for it, since about 90% of hoodoo practitioners were female and male, and female hoodoos differ significantly in physiology and magic. Stopped short of asking about the remaining 10%. Yuria said she could recognize and mate with compatible partners, and unfortunately, Almas was not one of them. She apologized gently, and he told her not to worry. As their meeting ended, he said he needed to go home and asked where she lived. Yuria hesitated for a moment. Bolton replied. Before he could ask more, she called for someone to come out. A man stepped out of the shadows. Almas was shocked. Someone asked how long the man had been there and complained about the strong smell of alcohol. Yuria introduced him as Bolton, her bodyguard. Almost looked baffled. Bolton laughed and teased Yuria for calling him that, suggesting she didn't really like him. Bolton then greeted Almas and thanked him for helping Yuria. Yuria told Almas to give Bolton the items he had carried. Surprised, Almas asked why she hadn't brought Bolton to help. Yuri simply replied that Bolton smelled bad. Almas handed over the heavy bags, and Bolton's face soured when he felt their unexpected weight. He muttered in disbelief that a kid had managed to carry it all, almost laughed it off, and told Yuria he was heading out. She waved and called goodbye, promising to see him again. Back in the village, he almost stood before the children to report the results of his trip. Because of the caramel grash trade, each child would now get 1 gold coin a month. Their farming had stabilized, so food was no longer a pressing concern. Major problems remained, with clothes and salt far too expensive. Almost explained that they could not rely only on food self-sufficiency, so they would need to produce other essentials too. Rose said he understood, but asked what they could do about it. Alma replied that they would start making pottery and would need a kiln. Tetra then asked what they should do first. Almost admitted he didn't know the exact process, but said they'd do their best to build a traditional kiln, instructed everyone to bring hoses and axes. And when Soyan asked where they'd build it, Almost said a nearby slope would be ideal. The image in his mind showed a slope was key for the kiln because hot air, being lighter, would rise and stay above the clay and produce the needed heat. The only real obstacle now was labor. It might take them a whole day to cut down a single tree, but he almost said, regardless, and then resolved they would push forward and get it done. Earlier, while trading goods with Yuria in the shop, Almas asked her which items were valuable in that region, but she took it as an awkward attempt to give her a gift. Actually, Almas was looking for information on items he could trade for basics like salt or clothing. Yuri pointed out the sudden change in his focus. She pointed at a pot and suggested pottery was valuable, and someone almost said it could be found along the street. But Yuria explained she did not mean ordinary local wares, she meant pottery from Karigia, which was different, more durable, vividly colored, and favored by royalty. Almas considered this. The pottery he'd seen so far was reddish and fragile. Tetra had once said Rose's pottery was glazed in the open air, a method Almas found primitive, similar to the Juman and Yaoira's from his former world. Open-air glazing allowed too much oxygen and too little heat, so the quality was poor. And he knew a kiln that limited oxygen and used an anagama firing would produce a more durable result. Sealing the chimneys and the kiln door in a closed chamber controls oxygen flow and lets temperatures rise. This produces a distinct black-toned pottery that open-air kilns cannot replicate. In other words, they would be capable of producing sewer. He wasn't sure which Karitzio pottery Yuria meant, but he trusted the Enajema method could make their pottery surpass the pottery from Rose Ice, and with Sue as a target, they now had a chance to produce the village's first specialty product. Later, while he worked, he barely noticed how the blessing made cutting trees effortless. Tetra wondered aloud whether he was even human. Pointing out his strength far exceeded a normal adult's. Almas felt he could now do the work of several people. The griffin had said the blessing wasn't anything special, but it was proving extremely useful for lumber work. After that, Almas told everyone they would dig holes along the slope next. They started the task, and when it was done, he wiped his forehead and said the digging was finished for now. Ron asked what they should dig next. He almost said it was time to collect clay, an essential material for pottery, especially for sealing the kiln. When Ron asked about making the kiln airtight, someone almost explained that the goal was to keep cold air out and hold heat. Without a tightly sealed kiln, creating those conditions would be impossible. Standing before the kiln they had built, he could hardly believe that a kiln made only from memories of his past life had turned out better than he expected. Then he told the children they would begin crafting by hand. Tetra concentrated on shaping her clay, while Ron and Rosewood started a messy clay fight, throwing clumps at each other. Soyen scolded them for throwing clay, and Graham added a warning. Despite this, a piece hit Rosewood's face, making him chase Ron, while Soy shouted at them not to run. Tetra muttered in annoyance and called them fools, and meanwhile almost pointed out that they could not even make basic tableware yet, would need many bowls, dishes, and storage pots. Tetra asked if it was really necessary to make so many. He emphasized making many pots because they are fragile, saying if they broke, the user would be responsible, so everyone needed their own set, and he instructed the group to let the first batch of pots dry. As they checked their work, Rosewood noticed a crack in his plate, and Ron said it was likely due to poor kneading. He almost put another piece into the kiln and announced the next phase, heating. Knowing the kiln they'd built wasn't professionally made, he didn't expect it to work flawlessly. They pressed on. Eventually, when he pulled a finished pot out of the kiln, the children were in awe. The vessel had a beautiful gray sheen, suggesting it was the gray-black glaze that was far more valuable than the reddish pottery common in the area. The firing was a real success for an amateur kiln, but not everything survived. Ron and Rosewood's pots had broken, and Soyan reminded them this was the result of their earlier horseplay. He nearly inspected one of the broken pieces, assuring them there would be more chances to do better. Tom sided with them. With the pottery finished, they moved on to making charcoal, almost demonstrated how to pack the wood tightly so there were no gaps, and used dry leaves to fill any unavoidable spaces. With the preparations finished, he lit the kiln while the children watched and told them to let it burn for a while, then seal both the chimney and the kiln door and leave it closed for a full day. After that, the charcoal would be ready. Tetra observed that the process closely resembled pottery, almost agreeing that both required minimal exposure to oxygen. Tetra asked about oxygen itself out of curiosity, nearly explained that oxygen is part of the air and is required for fire. Without oxygen, fire cannot exist. When she asked why oxygen itself didn't catch fire, he almost felt nervous. They managed to explain that fire was a chemical reaction, a combining of carbon and oxygen by oxidation. Oxygen did not burn on its own, but supported combustion. Tetra pondered this and said she might be able to understand it. They kept the kiln burning as instructed. When they finally opened it, they nearly inspected the resulting charcoal. Unfortunately, the quality was poor. He realized that, unlike his previous life where drums or barrels limited airflow, they had no such equipment here, so air was leaking in. But despite the poor results, the charcoal would be enough to get them through the winter. When winter ended and the new year began, the griffin arrived one day with children it had found roaming the forest, left them in Almas's care, and flew away. Noting the village population had grown by 10 over the winter, he almost turned to Tetra and asked how taxes were usually collected in the region. And Tetra said it depended on the country and the ruling nobles, but generally they were land tax, population tax, labor service, and military conscription. Almost turned to the newly arrived children and asked if their parents had abandoned them in the forest to avoid paying taxes. The children exchanged glances, unsure or unwilling to answer. Tetra added that, as far as she knew, Rosie's had lower taxes than most kingdoms. Its king did not burden his people with heavy taxes. Soyan pressed the children for the truth about where they had come from, and then told Almas that they claimed to be citizens of Rose size. Almas asked for clarification about their exact position in the row. Zoyan said they came from a territory ruled by a noble house called the Ash family. Almas asked more questions to make sense of it. Soyan clarified that the Ash family was the main noble family acting as landlords over that area. Trouble began when the Ash family was betrayed by their own retainers, she said. Those traitorous retainers even plotted to secede from the Roshai kingdom. The Roshai king refused to accept the rebellion, sparking internal conflict within the Ash family and its branches. He could almost piece the rest together in his mind. The internal power struggle cost many lives and forced higher taxes to fund the war. As a result, the region's storehouses were empty by winter, causing widespread hardship. As he absorbed it, Tetra asked whether that was really what had happened. Then, without warning, she bolted out of the room. He almost followed, calling after her, unsure what had suddenly triggered such a reaction. Catching up, he turned her around and found her face soaked with tears. Choking on her words, she hinted at her parents and something she had long suspected. Sobs overwhelmed her, and Almas pulled her into a silent embrace to comfort her. Later, back at their dwelling, he draped a blanket over the sleeping Tetra almost gently and stood nearby, reflecting quietly. It was clear now that Tetra had endured a painful past. Soy peeked into the room and asked Alma what had happened, feeling that something was off. Graham noted how rare it was to see Tetra cry. Alma said everyone needs to cry sometimes, then got ready to head out again. He almost considered how common it was for children to cry, whether from nightmares, arguments, or for no clear reason at all. Though he had comforted many children before, this was the first time he'd seen Tetra break down like this. When he stepped outside, Ron and Rose asked about Tetra and seemed almost reassured that she was fine for now. Deep down, he felt relieved. Holding back her emotions for so long felt unnatural to Tetra. Suppressing her sadness like that would harm her over time. He told them to act normal around her when she woke, since she would probably be embarrassed about crying. They nodded, then almost said it was time to return to the fields, not wanting to disturb Tetra's rest. Almost pausing as he resumed his tasks, he reflected on the truth about Tetra's past, the newcomer's arrival, and the village's uncertain future, knowing he had many things to weigh before deciding on their next course of action. In the kingdom of Rose Ice, Almas asked Yuria whether she would let him meet her father if he wished. Yuria hesitated, then said her father was always eager to meet her friends, so it should be fine. But she doubted Almas was truly ready, and he said he had been thinking about it for some time. The Ramali of forest where they lived was bordered by 4 countries, and Rosai was the most unstable, torn by internal conflicts. For safety, they needed an ally with real influence. He assumed Yuri, as their father, likely had the power they needed. Taxes would be a burden, but relying on the griffin's protection forever was not a viable strategy. Yuria sighed and accepted his reasoning. Walking through the neighborhood, Almas noticed many large, elegant homes and realized they were nearing the royal palace. The palace gates confirmed it. He froze when he entered. A regal-looking man stepped forward to greet him. Poised and authoritative, he welcomed him almost warmly and thanked him for being a friend to his daughter. The introduction carried a strangely paternal tone. Yuria leaned toward Almas and quietly admitted she had forgotten to mention a critical detail. Her father was the size of the King of Ro. Startled, Almas whispered in disbelief that she had not told him sooner. He was unprepared to stand before a monarch. Regaining his composure, he almost stared at the king. Almas knelt respectfully and introduced himself, saying it was an honor to be acknowledged by Yuria and to be accepted as her friend, and the king replied warmly that no formalities were needed and that he could speak as if addressing Yuria's father. It was the first time Yuria had brought a friend to meet him. Previously, her life had been all magical study, leaving no time for friendships. Flustered, Yuria interjected, and her father chuckled, telling her to relax as he thought back to how she had carried herself and realized she was not pretending to be ignorant or playing games when he helped her carry her belongings. She had never really had friends before, and then the king turned to Almas. It was clear he wasn't just trying to meet Yuri's father. Almas was looking for someone powerful and influential to rely on, so he stayed silent. The king told him he could be honest about his intentions, since he was the first person Yuria had ever truly called a friend, and the king would help if he could. So Almas shared everything with the king, except the part about his reincarnation to avoid complicating matters. And once the king understood the situation, when his people started abandoning children in the Ramaya forest, he saw it as his own responsibility. He nearly made it clear that he wasn't seeking asylum or protection from the king. The king agreed and said he wasn't thinking of that either. To Almas' great surprise, the king bowed his head to him. As the girl's father and the ruler responsible for his people's welfare, the king said he would not ignore what had been happening, and thanked Almas sincerely for guarding what he called the kingdom's essences, the children who represented its future, and Almas felt the full weight of the moment as the king of a nation had just bowed to him. Then the king made an offer. If Almas wanted to become a citizen of Roses, he would be welcome, and the king, using his full authority, vowed to protect Almas and his people as his sovereign duty. I almost raised a concern about their reliance on the griffin for food and whether it would complicate taxes. The king said Roses had a law exempting newly developed or explored land from taxes for 5 years. Since they could not afford substantial taxes now, 5 years would be more than enough, and by then the children should be able to stand on their own. Bowing respectfully, he accepted the king's offer. They would gradually integrate citizens into rows and commit to paying taxes in due time. Agreeing, the king formally welcomed them into the kingdom. I almost felt a wave of relief. This decision gave the children a solid foundation to grow and build a future, and for the first time in a long while, he let himself relax. The king asked whether any children in the village were from the Ash family. Almas confirmed they existed. The tax burden must have been too heavy for their families, so they were abandoned. They may simply have failed to survive the winter. The king fell silent, absorbing the weight of that reality. After a pause, he spoke again, saying he had granted Almas's request, and now asked Almas to hear his request in return. There were only 3. Almas thought it over. There were 3 requests. He had only asked the king for one thing, and it seemed fair. The first was that the king visit the village in person and see everything with his own eyes. It almost seemed a reasonable condition. The king had to judge whether he could truly trust him and agreed without hesitation. The king's second request was that Almas stay friends with Yuria. Almas agreed. The third request surprised them both. The king asked if Almas could teach Yuria math. Yuria was visibly shocked and almost said she was fine and capable and that others were better suited. But the king insisted because he had received reports that his near-mathematical skills surpassed even the kingdom's top merchants. He said it was embarrassing, but Yuria had a hard time with arithmetic, especially multiplication and division, could not remember even the simplest lessons, and insisted she could do it. Almas raised his hands and asked a simple math question about splitting 100 grains of rice among 25 children and how many each would get. Yuria counted on her fingers and confidently answered 10. Almas said her understanding was still rough. The king gave a pointed look that confirmed his judgment. Yuria had learned nothing from her previous teachers. Almas was already her friend, so he would surely help her learn. Almas, pragmatic, asked whether there would be payment for tutoring. The king offered 1 gold coin to Almas for the first week of each month in exchange for tutoring Yuria. He bowed almost respectfully, accepted the arrangement, and vowed to give Yuria all his support. Yuria protested. She wanted to study magic, not arithmetic. After the meeting ended, the king sat alone in the throne room, talking to himself and admitting he liked the boy Almas. Raymond then entered, called him brother, and asked what the king had been planning in that earlier conversation. Surprised, the king asked Raymond what he meant. Raymond pointed out that appointing a boy like Almas as Yuri's personal tutor was not a casual decision. The king said casually that since Almas was Yuri's friend, studying with him would work best because she had never done well with traditional methods. Raymond remained unconvinced and told the king he did not need to pretend. The king paused under his younger brother's sharp gaze. The king admitted it was not devious, but simply a form of investment, and when Raymond pressed him further, he said Almas was effectively the leader of a group living under the griffin's protection, which made him significant. He pointed out that tales of children raised by beasts, like tigers or dragons, were common in their kingdom, and people were always drawn to those myths. The image of a child protected by a griffin had strong symbolic meaning. That connection might be useful one day, Raymond chuckled as he finally understood, the king added. He still hadn't figured out how to use it. His first priority was to study his character and competence more closely. The weekly tutoring sessions with Yuria would give him plenty of chances. Raymond praised his brother's idea, but the king brushed it off and admitted he wasn't a bad ruler, just not especially capable. He regretted failing to protect the noble Lagwash family. The Ash clan was one of the most influential families in Rose Ice. The loss of such powerful allies was a major blow to the kingdom's authority, and it was not just a military or political setback, but also a symbolic one. Failing to protect the Ash family gave the impression that the throne favored certain branches, so more noble families doubted the crown's fairness and leadership. Raymond fell quiet, then voiced his concern about a more immediate threat, the growing alliance of neighboring kingdoms. He cursed King Herm for moving troops into their borders and added that Hyena, another ruler, was also making suspicious moves. Neither he nor Raymond had sons to inherit their legacies, which made things worse. The king then told his brother not to look so downcast. His queen had given him Yuria just before she died. Without a son, he found comfort and pride in Yuri's presence. Her mother dying shortly after from illness, and it seemed like fate. He said thoughtfully, laughed lightly, and pointed out that Raymond also had no sons. Raymond replied with a forced laugh, trying to move the conversation away from those painful memories. He suggested choosing a suitable heir from a branch family who could eventually stand beside Yuria. Elsewhere, Yuria sneezed unexpectedly and nearly asked whether she was all right. Back at the palace, the king looked down from the window at Almas and Yuria walking together and said quietly that above all, he wanted his daughter to be happy, even as problems were breaking out across the kingdom. A heavy worry weighed on him that the country could collapse during his reign. No matter what happened, he was determined to keep searching for a solution while he still lived. Watching the Almas from afar gave him a small spark of belief. Something about that young man, a child of the griffin, gave him hope. He hoped fate would let him see that potential realized. The king did not yet know that his small act of naming Almas his daughter's tutor would spark a miracle not just for Rosis, but for the entire Adelna Peninsula, the heart of the world. He was starting to notice that Tetra had been acting strangely lately, her reactions more anxious and guarded, especially around him. As he approached, she flinched and tried to turn away quickly, and he remembered she had always been a reserved, timid girl, but lately something had been weighing on her and upsetting her balance. Others around them had begun to notice, and it was becoming impossible to ignore. So if something had happened, it was his responsibility not to let her face it alone. He stepped closer and said she didn't have to speak if she wasn't ready, but encouraged her to share if something was wrong, and she looked at him quietly for a moment and asked if he had noticed it, saying it was obvious from the way she had been acting. She asked if she could trust him to keep it to himself. With complete sincerity, he assured her. She revealed her full name as Tetrash. The name explained everything, and Alma's eyes widened at the revelation. He recalled that her unease began after reports that the Ash family had been attacked by their own followers. He had suspected she might be tied to that noble family, but he did not expect her to be a direct member. So when Tetra asked if he was shocked, he admitted he was a little surprised since he had not imagined a daughter of the prestigious Ash family hiding among them. No matter her identity or past, he said she was still the same Tetra she'd always been. Her face softened, and a smile touched her lips as she said his words had comforted her, and she felt a little happier. So Almas relaxed and asked again what had been troubling her. Tetra said she wasn't sure, only that she thought her parents were dead. She could not explain it logically, but she felt it, and part of her wanted to believe they were only captured, not killed. Growing hatred for Robert Firm overwhelmed her. Almost then asked if Robert Firm, a retainer, had been behind her parents' deaths. She confirmed it. Robert had once been one of her father's most trusted subordinates, favored so much that he rose from a commoner to a high-ranking noble. That man betrayed them all and now occupied her father's position. Her heart burned with the rage she could neither deny nor forgive. Almas asked gently whether Tetra planned to take revenge on Robert, and Tetra admitted she didn't know. Deep down, she wanted to tear the man apart for what he'd done, but she did not want to give up the life she had now. Lacking close ties with the other ash branches, she had found something real among her friends here, and this place was her true home and her real family. Almas understood that Tetra's suffering came from the painful conflict between her thirst for justice and her desire to stay with those she cared about, leaving her torn in two directions. He told her she had nothing to fear. No one in their group would ever abandon her. Tetra looked at him, then glanced away and said quietly that her parents used to say something similar. Nearly gave a short cough. He told her that if she truly wanted to help, she should focus on protecting everyone here, himself included. And she was surprised and almost insisted he did not mean her, though she was smart, even smarter than him. And Tetra smiled through her tears and agreed. She vowed to do her best to protect everyone. Alma stood and told her firmly that if she ever sought revenge, she must tell him first. He promised to support her no matter what. He cared too much for her to let her carry it all alone. Tetra's eyes widened at the word important. His words left her shaken. Panic rose inside her. He had said something shockingly direct. It looked like a confession. He seemed almost entirely unaware of the weight behind his words, deliberately avoiding the divine blessing of language and speaking in plain Adelmian to make the moment feel more genuine. To him, she was family now, a younger sister, so he saw no reason for her shyness. Tetra, however, struggled with herself. She told herself letting the moment pass would be cowardly. She gathered her courage and blurted out that she did too. She also liked it, but before she could finish, Soyan burst in with a cheerful shout, carrying baskets of crops and saying how fun gardening had been, then stopped when she saw their serious faces and gasped in realization. Apologizing loudly for intruding on their moment, she dashed off dramatically. Calling to the others, she announced that Almas and Tetra were secretly dating. Tetra shouted that it was a misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Almost thought she was overreacting a bit, but ultimately, he was glad. Thanks to Cyan's interruption, Tetra seemed to have returned to her usual self again. Another year and several months went by. Almas turns 14. Ron noticed how fluent their leader had become in Adelian. I almost decided to return the Griffin's divine gift of language soon. Tetra had greatly improved his ability to read and write in Caritian, but a more pressing problem remained when Almas retrieved his coin pouch and a few coins fell to the ground. Picking them up, he told the tax collector he had come to pay the population tax for 3 people. It was himself, Ron, and Soin. The collector identified them as the group from the Romalia forest, and Alma confirmed it. The tax was manageable for now, but he knew it would rise as they got older. The Griffin's support would end within a year. They had to raise their village's self-sufficiency quickly. The tax burden was real. He even briefly considered convincing the Griffin to start paying him with alcohol. Returning home to the village, they almost allowed themselves to think about what their next steps should be. Tetra reminded him that plans could wait, and they had to begin by threshing the harvested wheat. She called to Rosewood, who stood idly, urging him to help. Rosewood insisted he was not good at such tasks, unlike Lulu. Just thinking about the last harvest wore him out. Processing it had been brutal. Soyan even said it had nearly killed them. He almost groaned at the thought that this year might be just as hard, and felt mentally unprepared. He asked Graham how they threshed the wheat last time. Graham said they started by picking the grains out by hand. Later, they tried scraping the wheat off the stalks with a piece of wood, but neither method proved very efficient. Someone then introduced them to a new device he had built called a senbikoki and demonstrated how to feed the wheat stalks into the wooden machine and pull them through. It allowed the grain to separate with much less effort. Everyone was amazed, especially Soyen, who noted how much easier it made the job. Amos explained that while the ideal version would use bamboo or metal, the wooden model worked well enough for now. Tetra watched the mechanism closely, noted the simplicity of its design, but praised the huge boost to efficiency, called it a great invention, and almost remembered seeing something like it in his previous life. Ron asked whether this would become widespread and was almost assured that he had many more ideas like it to offer. Suyan added that peeling the grains was also difficult. Rosewood asked if Almas had a solution for that too. Almas said he had a stone mortar, but this part would still require hard work. Ron eagerly volunteered to handle the mortar. They almost thought they had enough people to get by for now. Next came the task of separating the husks from the seeds. A child asked Tetra what she planned to do with the material in her hands. To separate husks from seeds, she said to shake the rice so the lighter husks rise and the heavier seeds settle to the bottom. Repeated shaking would take time, but separate them well. Almos called Tetra over to test another invention and revealed a new tool, a winnow. He told her to put the husks into the designated hole and showed her how to do it. A single turn of the handle left Tetra astonished. Almas separated a large amount of husk from the grain and noticed the wind from the internal propeller made it possible. Nearly proving her point, he said it was time to learn by trial and error. As he turned the handle again, it broke. Tetra noted he would need to make another. There was almost agreement. The harvesting process was nearly solved, but other challenges remained. Later, Yuria met him and asked how she looked, clearly hoping for a compliment. Was about to tell her she looked perfect and remarked she could be amazing when she tried. Yuria asked him not to be so formal when they were alone, because it made her feel awkward, and he said he spoke that way in case someone overheard. She insisted again that he drop the formal tone. He agreed. He asked if she still wanted him to keep teaching her math. She asked if he was tired of it. He said he wasn't. Suddenly, Yuria hugged him tightly and pleaded with him not to leave, which almost made it clear that he hadn't minded that way. The way her chest pressed against him distracted him, and he complained about how awkward the situation was. Yuria quickly pulled away, and he apologized and almost reminded her that his job was to teach her math, and she already knew it. Guilt nagged him about taking payment now that his duty was nearly finished. It could not go on forever. Yuria, flustered, admitted she did not know how to respond and thought she should ask her father directly. At the royal castle, the king raised Almas's recent wish to step down as Yuria's personal tutor, his voice concerned as he said he feared something had gone wrong, or worse, that Almas had come to dislike his daughter, and warned that without Almas, Yuria would be isolated again. That almost reassured him. He had simply begun to wonder how long he was expected to continue in this role. The king said there was no set end date. The arrangement would continue until Almas had nothing left to teach. After that, Almas would still be welcome at the castle. Besides, without Almas, there would be no one to play shogi with the king. In fact, he had almost single-handedly created this game of shogi. Frustrated by the lack of entertainment in the kingdom of Adelina, he devised a strategic war board game he thought could be profitable. Lulu once said it was easy to copy, but not sellable. I was almost caught off guard by her words. Tetra had said the same thing, and it was a valid concern in a world with no concept of patents. Anything that didn't require a special production process could be copied freely, leaving the creator with no protection or income. He briefly thought about simplifying the game. Lulu found it too complex, and Ron could not play it at all. Presenting it to the King of Rose Eyes instead might have made it popular with the nobility. That could have brought him recognition and prestige as the inventor and improved his standing with the Rose Eyes royal family. Once back at the castle, the king offered him a seat. During their regular shogi match, he realized that since he introduced the game, the king had taken more interest in him. With the right strategy, he thought he might even become a palace guard or soldier someday. A career change in this new world didn't seem so far-fetched, especially once the children he cared for grew up and no longer needed him. During their match, the conversation nearly returned to Yuria and her tutoring. He realized that apart from him, Yuria had no close companions. The king confirmed it. She explained that a falling out with a formerly friendly noble family had left her isolated. Someone almost asked if Yuria was only allowed to associate with people who were politically useful. The king denied it and then explained. Being a royal child, Yuria often finds commoners keep their distance, intimidated by her status. One almost noticed that Yuria wasn't the type to flaunt her authority. The king agreed wholeheartedly. Rank wasn't the problem. Yuria had an extraordinary, rare gift for voodoo magic, a talent said to appear only once in 1,000 years. When she came of age, destiny made her the chief priestess, a position as illustrious as it was demanding. Almas privately found the idea dramatic and asked whether such privileged information was safe to share. The king replied that Yuri's abilities were widely known. The only condition was that Almas keep it to himself. The king revealed a deeper truth, that Yuria was his only daughter. Her future husband would become the king of Rose Ice, making her a target for ambitious suitors, but Yuria could spot those only after her status, so real connections were rare. Ironically, she felt most comfortable around people who did not know her position, and someone then suggested that Yuri hide her identity and try to make friends with the townspeople, but the king admitted that such a plan was unlikely to work. In the capital, everyone recognized her, so leaving was not an option due to security concerns. Despite her graceful appearance, Yuria was actually very shy. Almas had been a lucky accident in her life, one of the few people she could connect with. Yuri's need to get a particular medicinal plant finally overcame her shyness. Seeing Yuri's determination, Almas wondered if trustworthy young people existed outside the royal circle whom Yuri hadn't yet met. He thought of his own village, a quiet, safe place where she could meet others more freely, and nearly proposed the idea to the king. The monarch paused, then acknowledged it was a brilliant suggestion. Almost was surprised by the king's quick approval. Raymond, the king's brother, looked worried. Many questioned the decision to allow Yuria to visit the Griffin Forest, especially given how close it is to the village. But the king reminded Raymond that he himself had declared the area safe. At that moment, Raymond remembered his earlier assessment and confirmed it was safe, since he had sent a voodoo magician to scout the forest by soul riding. This advanced, dangerous magic let a magician's soul inhabit an animal, in this case, an owl. The operation succeeded. The soul returned unharmed, and scouting confirmed the forest was safe. Olmos said he had communicated with the griffin, and Raymond confirmed that was true. Still, Raymond hesitated, pointing out that the Griffin Forest was uncharted and offered no guarantees, and he wondered if Yuria really needed to make friends. After a moment, the king said Raymond might be misunderstanding him. He did not just want Yuria to socialize. He wanted her to form a bond with the Griffin. Raymond was stunned by the ambition. He paused before taking a nervous sip of his drink. Admitting he might still be too cautious, he finally agreed it was worth trying. The king then shifted the topic toward Almas and admitted a growing fondness for the young man. If everyone wanted it for the wrong reasons, he would gladly make him a royal vassal. Raymond readily recognized that Almas was exceptional. At his age, he had already learned subjects like mathematics and Christian scholarship, a scholarly field few young people in the kingdom understood. Raymond even suggested granting him land to match his abilities. Amused, the king suggested that if all this were given land, they'd need to find him a noble family to marry into, perhaps even someone from Raymond's own lineage. Raymond raised an eyebrow and asked whether his family name was being added to the list. The king chuckled, said yes, and added it too, and laughter passed between them in a rare moment of camaraderie in the throne room. Back in the village, Yuria burst in with bold energy, greeted the villagers warmly, introduced herself, and thanked them for the care Alma had shown her. The royal visit was the settlement's first, making it a momentous occasion. After meeting Ron and Rosewood, Yuria made a point of respectfully greeting everyone else. Almas, however, noticed subtle signs of nervousness in her behavior. During the warm welcome, Soyan raised a hand and asked a direct, innocent question about Yuria and Alma's relationship. Yuria suddenly threw her arms around Almas and declared they were lovers. The village erupted in gasps and stunned faces. Almas flushed and hastily tried to dismiss the remark, earnestly telling Yuria to stop with such reckless jokes, while Tetra, clearly disturbed, demanded to know whether there was any truth to what had been said, and Almas nervously called it a misunderstanding. He explained that Yuria was only teasing him and begged her to stop saying strange things. Yuria, a teasing glint in her eye, replied she only wanted to fluster him a little. Then, almost wistfully, she asked whether her words had really been sincere and whether that would be a problem, then turned and walked off. As Alma stood there, stunned, he felt a sharp stomp on his foot. Looking down, he saw Tetra glaring at him. Wincing in pain, he begged her to stop, saying it hurt and there was no need to be angry. Tetra's narrowed eyes said otherwise, and the day had suddenly taken a dramatic turn. In the quiet village, tension flared when Tetra suddenly stomped on every misstep. She turned away without a word. Almas Winston Payne tried to reason with her, but her silence made it clear she was furious. As he stood there, nursing his foot, a familiar voice broke the silence. Almost turned, then froze at the sight of Bolton Pompey leaning casually against a nearby wall with a bottle in his hand. Grinning and holding the drink, Bolton wiped his mouth and made a cryptic remark about how troublesome it was to be popular. He nearly blinked in confusion and instinctively glanced at the group of village children, expecting a larger security presence because of Yuri's status, so Bolton's lone figure fell short. Bolton dismissed the concern, seeing the lack of extra guards as proof of the king's trust in Almas. Almas was not convinced. It could just as easily reflect how many enemies Bolton had killed in the king's service, making him confident enough to entrust his only daughter to a single man. Bolton, sardonic and modest, brushed off the praise by calling himself an alcoholic, and joked that if he neglected his duties, things would likely be better for Almas. Almas rejected the implication in his mind. A hidden truth consumed him. Tetra, still fuming, was no ordinary girl. As the daughter of Lagos Ash, a close confidant of the King of Roses, she was a Tetra Ash, a noble with political influence. Exposing her identity, especially to Bolton, would trigger a chain of consequences. The king would certainly order her back to the capital, though she almost believed she would be happier returning home. Tetra wanted no part of it and had no desire for the arranged marriage that would await her in Rosize. Fortunately, Bolton was too drunk to connect the dots. At 10, she should have been completely unknown to him. Hopefully, it stayed that way. Bolton, seeing Yuria mingle with the villagers, said thank you very much. He rubbed the back of his head and shifted the conversation by casually asking Almas what his plans were for entertaining the princess. Almost offered a strange idea: have Yuria teach the villagers voodoo magic. Bolton blinked, unsure it really counted as play. Almost knew the idea was odd, but for someone like Yuria, who preferred poisonous plants to flowers, ordinary games would never be enough. Bolton nodded, accepting the truth. Almas wanted more than amusement. He pictured a self-sustaining village with practical skills and arcane defenses. Teaching numbers and logic was within his reach, but voodoo was beyond him, and he knew it mattered because some girls in the village might show talent. Even if the boys weren't suited to practicing it, learning to defend against curses would be invaluable. Teaching voodoo would let Yuria contribute and help her form real bonds with the others, which she desperately needed. Bolton softened and said that even as a royal guard, he was still a commoner. Almas didn't need to be so formal. Almas hesitated, then accepted that with a quiet nod. As they walked through the woods, the conversation shifted again, and nearly praised Bolton for rising to the rank of royal guard. Bolton credited the Rosai's king's meritocratic system, saying status didn't matter and skill did. Bolton suggested Almas would likely be recruited in a few years. At 14, Almas was still too young, but the minimum age for government service was only 17. If Almas played his cards right, Bolton said he could secure a government post and might even be granted his own territory. Almas dismissed the idea as an exaggeration, but Bolton said the country was unstable and needed exceptional talent even from outsiders, and the king expected a lot from Almas. The idea of becoming a government official almost took hold. It was not an unpleasant prospect, especially if it came after achieving what he truly wanted. Seeing the villagers become fully independent appealed to him. The thought of establishing a powerful, self-sufficient household in another world was attractive. A future like that no longer seemed so far away. Meanwhile, Bolton, half amused and half bewildered, looked toward a group of girls clustered nearby and wondered whether they really understood the voodoo being taught to them. They were almost like a firm, casually adding that they had kept up with his math lessons. That revelation stunned Bolton. He hadn't expected children in a remote village to be learning arithmetic, much less being taught by someone their own age. Bolton almost elaborated that some of the top students were even outperforming Yuria. One child had already mastered Korean, the old scholarly tongue, and was teaching the others to read and write. Bolton stared in disbelief. Seeing a village where children could read, write, solve equations, and practice magic, a visitor wondered if Almas was secretly a genius teacher. Almas thought that if the children could reach such levels, Ron and the others might one day hold official posts. Almas asked Bolton whether they could enter court service. Bolton said the king would make the final decision, but that it was possible. Only time would tell. Turning to the surrounding fields, Bolton said it was about time he did some actual work. He mentioned a curious rumor he had heard that the villagers did not divide their land into individual plots. I almost realized then that Bolton's presence was not just to guard Yuria, but to observe the village, probably for the king. I almost said that dividing farmland led to lower crop yields. Bolton wrote that down quickly, and Almas asked that when the information reached the king, it be presented as his idea. Bolton nodded, then pointed at a strange tool nearby and asked what it was. Almost identified it as a Simba Koki, a winnowing machine, and when Bolton asked what it was for, almost went into detail explaining how the tool was used in post-harvest processing. Bolton, already impressed by the new farming methods, crop rotation techniques, and specialized tools, felt almost overwhelmed, as if the whole village was a trove of innovations, and he asked whether Almas had invented it all himself. But Almas, embarrassed, downplayed it. Still, he offered to help. The Simbakoki was easy to copy, and the teeth should be metal for durability. If Bolton wanted to understand how it worked, almost suggested taking apart one of the failed prototypes. Better yet, if Bolton could provide some lambskin parchment, almost would draft complete schematics. Bolton agreed gratefully. He noticed the village was making its own pottery and charcoal, and a strange scent drew his attention. So he asked about it and was told the smell came from chrysanthemum flowers used as natural insect repellents. Both were struck by the idea of using flowers as insecticide, and even more by the fact that it could be used immediately to protect crops from pests, and he couldn't believe how much the unassuming village had to offer. None of this matched Bolton's expectations, and he admitted he was neither a scholar nor a soldier. Although he might not grasp the full depth of the knowledge, he still recognized its national value. These ideas could improve the whole kingdom. He thanked Almas sincerely. Almas then asked a favor, requesting his help to present the work to the king. Bolton agreed with a smile and said perhaps the gods had not forsaken them after all. Nearby, Yuria called out, urging Almas to stop wasting time with a drunk and come to her. So Almas smiled, excused himself, and headed her way. Bolton laughed and teased him about being Prince Charming. Yuria flushed and snapped that the drunk should drown in his liquor and die. Bolton just laughed and said he wished it were that easy. And as Almas walked away, he shook his head, amused, thinking how deeply Bolton loved alcohol. At the royal castle, the king asked about Yuri's social progress, and Almas replied that she was enjoying herself. Then, unfurling a scroll, the king shifted the topic to a more urgent matter and asked Almas for her opinion on crop rotation. When the king referenced a report Bolton had submitted, Almas realized the true reason he had been summoned. Rotary agriculture was a well-established method and helped drive England's 18th century agricultural revolution. But Almas found explaining it without revealing his past difficult, so he said cautiously that the method was theoretically sound. His fields had not yet completed a full 4-year cycle, so he could not give absolute confirmation. The king told him to record the harvest yields and submit them as data. He almost agreed, knowing how such records might be used. The king asked if Almas believed rotary agriculture could be used throughout the kingdom. Almas said it did not work well on a small scale, and that scaling it up required large areas of land and much labor, both constrained by the kingdom's feudal customs. Removing communal land rights and creating private ownership was essential, but enforcing that reform against powerful clans and their serfs seemed impossible under Rosa's current government. This made the king rethink his government's structure. Almas, meanwhile, reflected on England's history, recalling how the Second Enclosure movement allowed rotary agriculture to flourish. He doubted that such systemic transformation could be achieved at the row size. Rosa's military structure made things worse, reminding the king that much of the country's military strength came from soldiers who farmed their own land, and reducing that farming would directly weaken the military. Soldiers equipped themselves in rows. The wealthy could afford horses and served as cavalry. Others would become spearmen or light infantry, depending on what they could afford. Skill could make up for lack of money, but gear and supplies still shaped a soldier's effectiveness, and victories usually made the nobility richer, deepening inequality. The king agreed that aggressive land grabs were unnecessary. Even the row-size clan followed that rule. Wealthier landowners and nobles often kept slaves. Therefore, the shift toward rotary agriculture should be gradual and most agreed. He saw that row size, unlike England, could implement top-down reforms starting with the monarch, then the noble clans, and finally the commoners. Even a partial implementation would bring benefits. In his own village, small, gradual changes were producing steady progress. Access to more livestock, especially horses or oxen, would speed their development. Pointing to an illustration, the king changed the topic and proposed introducing the Simba cookie and the winner to Rose size, then offered Miss a reward for his service. When asked what he desired, almost asked for a few farm horses. The king agreed to give him 2 horses and a year's supply of fodder. He stood almost silent, aware of how extraordinary the gift was. In most villages, horses were prized and almost unattainable, yet Almas had acquired them with surprising ease, and while they were valuable, they were hard to keep and ate enormously. So Almas knew feeding even one would strain the village's resources, and receiving a year's feed with the horses was an unexpected blessing and a clear sign of the king's generosity, the equivalent in this world of 2 tractors and a year's fuel, a major investment. The king admitted to Almas in a thoughtful tone that he had clearly underestimated him. He was proving to be more than his daughter's tutor or a clever toy maker. Almas seemed like a prodigy, a gift from the divine griffin. Almas thought the praise overblown, but the king was not just being polite. There was more to discuss, and the king wanted another opinion. The king asked to include his brother Raymond in the next conversation. Almas had no objection. These matters were the king's prerogative. Soon, Raymond arrived, greeted Almas with casual familiarity, and suggested they resume their nightly shogai matches. Ever competitive, he still longed to beat his brother in the game. Almas agreed, but made no definite promise. Later that evening, sitting at the king's table, the discussion deepened. The king turned to Almas once more, confident he understood the kingdom's delicate political framework, and asked Almas for his assessment of the system. After a pause, Almas answered that the structure was dangerously fragile and explained the kingdom rested on 2 unstable pillars, bloodlines and territorial inheritance. The first generation of noble families were deeply loyal to the crown, but over time, the second and third generations became less devoted, and as their lineage became less pure, their commitment to the state weakened too. These lands were not gifts from the current monarch, but were passed down from their ancestors, so their loyalty to the king was more tradition than duty, and this inherited ownership caused serious complications. The king had limited financial and military influence spread thin across regions governed by powerful noble families. In wars or major public projects like flood control, the crown had to rely on the cooperation and self-interest of local powers, which was hard to secure. A fragmented structure made quick coordination nearly impossible, and betrayal by even one powerful house could instantly cripple the kingdom's strength. Emphasize the greatest danger when large infrastructure projects require alignment among multiple towns or villages. The king's authority was too weak to mobilize such collective action under the current system. Worse, if noble families formed marriage ties with foreign nations, this could let outside powers gain influence or even enable treason in wartime. His words hit home. The king and Raymond exchanged a silent, knowing glance. The king assured Almas that at least in royal circles, cross-national marriages among the nobility were strictly forbidden. This required that the law also apply to the most powerful domestic aristocratic families. Allowing a single family to break that rule could let them rebel and, by their influence, trigger a nationwide collapse. The king agreed, and Raymond admitted he had not thought of that before. Almas had already followed the idea through and pointed out that alliances that seemed harmless, like marriages among nobles, could spark a widespread rebellion if loyalties shifted. so the kingdom's unity depended on guarding against those risks. Curious and open-minded, the king asked Almos for his ideas on improving Rosai's political system and welcomed any suggestion, no matter how ambitious. Almos, slightly amused by the surreal moment, couldn't help thinking this was how things worked when someone befriended royalty, and in his previous life, such high-level political talks would have happened over a fine meal in an exclusive restaurant, not in the throne room of a foreign world. Nonetheless, he nearly answered seriously and suggested centralization as the goal. A brief thought went to the Taika reforms of his old world, which moved Japan from aristocratic rule to a centralized imperial system. Later, the Meiji government's reforms dismantled the regional domains of the daimyo and replaced them with a prefectural system tightly controlled by the central government. Those ideas had been drilled into him during compulsory education and were now coming to life in a new reality. Surprisingly, the king not only welcomed the idea, but agreed with it wholeheartedly. Raymond, equally astonished, pointed out the uncanny coincidence that a mere child had reached the same conclusion. Raymond pressed Almos for details on how this centralization could be achieved. Almos gathered his thoughts and said there must be a clear divide between the royalty and the rest of the nobility, supported by a divine justification that could not be questioned. He suggested inventing a myth that the Rosai's clan were descendants of the gods. Unsure about the world's religious system, he believed that claiming divine legitimacy could shift the balance of power in their favor. Divine authority alone was not enough. They had almost added that, at the very least. Control over taxation and military force should be stripped from the noble families and placed under the crown, he argued, to lay the foundation for effective central governance. However, there was no clear plan to implement such reforms. These were ideas born of historical hindsight rather than practical experience. The king fell into thought, absorbing all Mrs. Suggestions said. After a pause, he admitted he already had a secret plan to centralize power. Almos was taken aback and could hardly believe it. From history, he knew centralization was often romanticized, but hard and painful to carry out. He was deeply impressed that the king had a plan. Yet the king admitted there was a problem. The method was technically sound, but he disliked it, comparing it to cooking a dish correctly only for the ingredients to spoil and ruin his appetite. Clutching his stomach as he spoke made it clear something was wrong, and Raymond immediately moved to help. His eyes nearly widened in shock when he saw traces of blood. Trying to play it down, the king wiped his mouth with a napkin Raymond handed him and forced himself to calm down. He offered a strained apology for showing vulnerability in front of Almos, and Almos, concerned, asked if it was a chronic illness and when it had started. The king said it had plagued him for 10 years, and that length of suffering startled Almos. He suspected this was why Yuria had thrown herself into studying voodoo magic. The king acknowledged her effort. Doubting even voodoo could heal him, the king refused to say when asked how much time remained, as if knowing the answer would be a burden he did not want to bear. The room grew tense as the king grew serious again. He gave Almos one final task: produce a plan for centralization. Trusting Almos's intellect, the king believed he could at least begin to shape something useful. It was uncertain if it would be put into effect, but the king hoped it would be finished before his time ran out. Understanding the weight of the request, Almos promised solemnly to give it his all. Soyan announced Almos's return in an eager, excited voice. She said he had not returned empty-handed, but had brought something remarkable. Rose, curious, asked whether it was connected to his recent visit to the kingdom of Rosich. Without answering, Soyan grabbed the others and urged them to follow her. Ron, slightly annoyed but intrigued, complied as they made their way toward the edge of the village. In the distance, Ron saw a pair of figures, squinted, pointed toward them, and said, awestruck, they were horses. The children leaned forward, eager to greet their returning leader. Calm and collected, Almus met them with a quiet nod. Ron stood in stunned wonder. It was his first time seeing horses up close, let alone touching one. His hands ran along the horse's muscular frame, clearly amazed by its strength and stature. Then something unexpected caught Rosewood's attention. A girl sat behind Almos on one of the horses, her face distant. Her gaze avoiding theirs, startled and curious, Rosewood asked who she was, and almost explained that the girl's name was Rhea, a slave gifted to him by the king of Rose Ice. And then, unsure how to react, he asked why he had taken a slave. Almost clarified that she wasn't taken out of cruelty or indulgence, but out of necessity. No one in the village knew anything about horses, and without guidance, the animals would be impossible to manage. Rhea knew horse care and would bridge that gap. It was a practical decision, and feeding one more person wouldn't strain their resources. Almost recalled the moment in Rose Ice. They discussed the issue with the king and quickly offered a solution. Raymond went with Almus to the slave quarters, pointed to a quiet girl, and asked the slaver for her name, Rhea. He almost introduced himself, but she replied in a language he couldn't understand. Almus was surprised to learn from Raymond that the language was Sioux from Germany, completely foreign to him. That was the first time he realized the world had languages beyond Adelian and Carishian. Back in the village, he gathered the others and explained Rhea's situation. Because she could not speak their language, they would relay their intentions through him. More importantly, he insisted Rhea be treated like everyone else in the village. Though she had arrived a slave, she was one of them now, and Rosewood looked uneasy, noticed it at once, and teased him by suggesting he had taken an interest in Rhea. Rosewood grew flustered and denied it, panicking in a way that only made Alma smile knowingly. Soini, playful as ever, used the moment to ask for her souvenir. Alma directed her to a saddlebag on the horse where some dried meat was kept, and warned her to take only a little if she planned to share it. Soyan smiled and handed a portion to Ron, who accepted it eagerly. Watching the scene, he couldn't help reflecting. 14-year-olds were always so curious about love. As an older brother figure, he felt a mix of amusement and uncertainty. It felt like the start of adolescence taking root among them. A voice suddenly called out that a wild boar had been taken down. Everyone turned to the sound and saw a boy carrying the heavy beast on his shoulder. Ron, wide-eyed, asked who he was, and the boy laughed, saying it was Graham, of course, and people stared in disbelief, because at just 12, Graham had the most developed build in the group. And when asked, he said his physique came from using a bow, which required strength and control. But the surprises were not over. A girl stepped forward in a strange outfit, speaking boldly and demanding praise. He nearly blinked, trying to make sense of what she was wearing. It took a moment before he recognized her as Lulu. Her clothes were camouflage, cleverly made to blend into the forest. Graham asked if she was using voodoo to attract the boar. Lulu proudly said Yuria herself had told her she had a talent for it, and with the leader back, foreign tongues in the air, hunting trophies on display, and signs of maturing youth, the village of Almus buzzed with change as each new face, skill, and feeling pushed it closer to becoming far greater than it had ever been before. Standing among the familiar faces of his village, he felt a quiet pride as he watched how far everyone had come, their growth clear and each person contributing in their own way. And though he did not care for voodoo himself, he was glad to see others thrive with it. So he turned to practical matters and announced a bold new goal to expand their fields to 3 times their size with the help of the horses. Villagers burst into cheers, energized by the vision of progress. Approaching Tetra, he asked about the goats. They had already cleared most of the weeds in the wasteland, she said, and almost chuckled, noting the goats were relentless eaters, devouring nearly everything in their path. He assigned the task of tilling the new field to Rhea, their newly arrived horse caretaker, and instructed Rosewood to assist her. Tetra, curious, asked about Rhea and briefly explained her role, so everyone knew she was essential to managing the horses. During preparations, Tetra noticed something attached to the horses. He asked Almas what it was, and Almas explained that along with the horses, the king had also provided a plow and hero tools needed for farming, had stressed their importance, and Almas had been genuinely grateful. Declaring the equipment his to use, he turned to Rosewood. Rosewood grabbed the plow handles, and found the tool moved smoothly through the soil. The difference was striking. The others watched in amazement as the task unfolded with surprising speed and ease. Ron, wide-eyed, asked what was wrong when Rose began shouting, and Rose groaned that even holding on hurt because his hand stung from the string, while Soyan said the speed was on a completely different level, almost unrecognizable, and that horsepower had redefined their labor, making their past efforts almost embarrassing by comparison. Encouraged but misinstructed, the group prepared the second plow and began learning how to ride the horses. Momentum was on their side, and he planned to seize it, but Soyan reminded him that he'd mentioned a new crop or resource, which nearly confirmed it. The word cannabis made him hesitate. Cannabis was known as a narcotic, yet Yuria noted its use in voodoo, especially as a painkiller. Unlike some regions that abused it for indulgence, the Adelina Peninsula had little history with narcotics. In this context, cannabis had practical and medicinal potential. Yuria explained that hemp seeds were highly nutritious, and hemp fibers could be useful in many ways. He almost remembered that in a previous life, hemp seeds were part of Shikamida garashi, a Japanese spice blend. Soyan assumed every miss had chosen him to make her clothes. He clarified that the fibers would be used, but not for fabric, his thoughts turning to linen strings and cords, materials vital in his past world, and Ian admitted she was unsure how useful hemp would be, but agreed to try growing it for experiments, and almost mentioned a looming reality. The Griffins' support for their village would end after this summer, and their tax obligations were steadily increasing. Tetra immediately recognized the danger and saw the village facing a potential financial crisis. They nearly agreed that the solution was to develop unique products the village could produce and trade, so I guessed hemp might be one of them. It was nearly certain there was a strong candidate, so he invited them to follow him, and their curiosity piqued. Across the Adelina Peninsula, 3 main materials were used to record information: papyrus, sheepskin, and wooden planks. Both materials had serious drawbacks. Papyrus was fragile and tore easily when folded, and sheepskin, though durable, was prone to insect damage. Wooden planks were thick and unwieldy and restricted writing to short texts, but Almas had something else in mind: paper, a material far superior to all 3. As they discussed the idea, Tetra raised a valid concern. Most citizens could not read or write, so there might be little real demand. Almas pointed out that literacy was rare among common people, but essential for rulers, nobles, and scholars who could provide it directly to those who needed it. And slowly, Tetra realized Almas was thinking of the king of Rosais. A ruler's duties went beyond those of most people, including keeping records of history and law. Now it was clear there would be demand, and she nodded, convinced. He nearly let himself look ahead, imagining a future where the village did not just survive, but thrived, and some of the children running beside him might one day become paper craftsmen. That thought felt both grounding and motivating. Outside, Almas dug a hole along the riverbank to show them a simple, effective trick for making a small pool, bringing the next step in papermaking within reach and laying the foundation of their new industry with tree bark and the hemp he had brought back from his journey. These would be the foundation for something far more ambitious. Tetra, curious about the process, asked why the materials had to be soaked in water and learned it was to soften them. Without proper soaking, it would be impossible to peel away the tough black outer bark and reach the fibrous core inside. As she worked separating the fibers, she noted that even if they were not taking the process completely seriously this time, precision would matter later. The more accurately the fibers were prepared, the wider and smoother the final paper would be. The next day, the process entered a new phase when crushed ash was added to the soaking water, turning it into a milky white liquid called lye. Tetra asked what lye was, prompting Almas to explain that they really needed an alkaline solution, but lye was close enough, since alkaline substances break down organic tissue, so they mixed bark, hemp, straw, and lye in a large pot and brought it to a boil. As steam rose and the mix bubbled, Soyan said it looked like a hearty stew, the rich, earthy scent filling the air. And Ron wandered over, his nose twitching, asking for a taste, while Soyan, amused, almost warned him that if he tried, he'd be stuck with a stomachache for the rest of the day. After the boiling finished, the mixture was left to cool, then rinsed thoroughly and returned to the water pit to soak overnight. Ron, growing impatient, asked how much longer the process would take. I almost told him it was nearly finished. Later that evening, after the day's fieldwork ended, someone almost called everyone together. It was time for the next step. The material had to be pounded while still damp, and Ron eagerly offered to take charge. As he worked the mortar, he almost switched to making starch glue from wheat flour, which he remembered doing easily in his previous life. Boiling the flour released the starch, which he mixed with the pulp to form a thickened mixture that was the true beginning of paper. Someone asked if what they'd made was really paper. It needed clarifying that it was only the base. All that was left was shaping and drying it properly. Tetra lifted a wooden frame with curiosity and asked whether it was used to drain water. Someone nearly confirmed and called it a paper tray. Once the pulp was poured in, it was just mass production. He showed how to spread the mixture evenly over the tray, gently shaking it until the surface was smooth. Tetra admired how delicate and beautiful it looked and almost told them to repeat the process. Pour, smooth, and finally lift the top frame and leave the sheets to dry. Tetra asked whether the process was going well, then examined the first few sheets. They were not perfect, but surprisingly good for a first attempt. Thinner than he expected, the paper had specks of dust on its surface, but showed potential as he held a sheet up for everyone to see. They reacted immediately with awe and ran their fingers over it, marveling at its texture. Lighter than sheepskin, smoother than wooden planks, and softer than papyrus, it felt like a revelation. Tetra, thrilled, said they could mass-produce and sell it. He almost smiled, but kept a quiet thought that credit belonged to the brilliant mind in ancient China who first invented paper, while here it was the first of its kind and he had recreated something that could change history. He kept whispering, "I'm sorry," over and over. Then, driven by excitement, decided this paper would be the village's first true product to bring to the king of roses. The age of parchment, bark, and planks was fading, and a new medium was beginning its place in this world's history. He almost stood before the king of rose ice, offering the fruit of his village's latest labor, a smooth, pale sheet of paper. Stepping forward with curiosity in his eyes, the king ran his fingers across the surface. Taking a quill, he tested it. The ink flowed cleanly and the sheet held firm. He was impressed. This was no fragile papyrus or awkward wooden plank. It was a remarkable new medium. The king acknowledged the craftsmanship and asked where it had come from. Almost explained that his village had made it and that he wanted to give some as a gift. The king, clearly intrigued, offered to buy the entire batch. A quiet triumph lit Alma's eyes, but the conversation did not end there. The king, with a calculating glint, asked whether Almas would share the production method. Almas, cautious but polite, said he would if the village's profits were guaranteed. Laughing, the king admitted it was a joke, said he had no intention of seizing the process, and issued a royal command. Almas would continue refining the paper over the next 3 years. Once its quality met the standard for large-scale use, the crown would buy it in bulk. The king said he saw paper as a future national industry. It was not ready yet. Until then, Almas would keep exclusive rights. The product must not be sold elsewhere. Nearly accepted. Privately, he admired the king's foresight. The monarch had already seen the risks that Almas might leak the knowledge or sell it, and had acted first to stop it through his evaluations, by sending Bartolo, or with quiet caution, making clear he trusted few. Still, the arrangement stabilized the village's income, and for that, Almas was grateful. A year went by. The Griffin's final season of divine support had ended. Walking through the forest where it began, he almost breathed in the cool air as the trees whispered softly around him. The day had arrived. The village had grown resilient, powered by innovations like rotary agriculture, charcoal production, pottery, income from tutoring, livestock, paper, and even protection magic. There had been countless challenges, yet they had somehow endured. Memories of his first meeting with the Griffin came back, showing how much had changed since that day. If it had not happened, he would not have received the divine gift of language, which had enabled so much of his progress. Reaching the sacred grove, he called out. With regal calm, the Griffin stirred and rose. It praised Almas for leading the village without losing a single life. He could almost picture them all in his mind: Tetra, Swin, Ron, Rosewood, Lulu, and the others. Admitting he had not done it alone, his tone was humble, but the Griffin disagreed. It was almost impossible to tell who had won the king's support, who had inspired the children, and who had kept the village thriving through every challenge. The Griffin asked whether he still needed the divine language gift. He almost hesitated. Technically, he no longer needed it, but deep down, he still struggled to communicate with Rhea. She was getting better at Adelian, and, surprisingly, Rosewood had begun studying Germanizu with determination, and even Lulu teased that he was pushing himself for love. It almost seemed to muse on the quiet strength of affection, moving people in ways few things could. Still, a promise had to be kept. Almas nodded and said he was ready to return the gift. The Griffin approached and pressed its beak gently against Almas's forehead. A strange sensation washed over him, as if something was being pulled out of him. Then the Griffin gave a final message. Miss was to visit often, and to show any gratitude he felt, he should bring offerings. Alcohol in particular almost smiled in agreement. On a ridge above the village, Almas looked down. Tetra appeared beside him, quietly welcoming him back and asking about the Griffin. He almost said the Griffin sent its regards and asked for fruit wine. Petra nodded, her expression soft. That marked the end of the mission the Griffin had entrusted to Almas. One chapter closed and another opened quietly beneath the sunlit hills of the village they had built together. It almost stood overlooking the village that had once been a desolate patch of land. Now, the village thrived with life, its people industrious, and its fields promising a rich harvest, and he watched the daily activity with quiet pride, because the village had become self-sufficient and easier to live in than many others. After a long journey, everyone had worked tirelessly to reach this point. With a sense of finality, he told Tetra to gather everyone for an important announcement as the villagers assembled. He almost shared what he had learned after Yuria told him, and he saw it with his own eyes. The kingdom of Rosize enjoyed a plentiful harvest this year. The news might have sounded unrelated. He had a reason for bringing it up. Turning to Rosewood, he asked if he had been born in Roses. Rosewood confirmed it and almost told him and everyone else from Roses that they could now return home. The village had grown strong enough to let go. The griffin's support had ended, and they almost believed it was time for those children to be reunited with their families. Deep down, they could sense that losing even one of them, especially someone as capable as Rosewood, would leave gaps in their labor force. It made no difference because he believed children belonged with their parents, while he himself had never known his own parents. These children have families waiting, and now that things have stabilized, they should be reunited with them. The reaction he expected never came. Instead, Rose snapped back and called him a fool. He almost faltered, thinking he had suddenly lost the ability to speak clearly without the griffin's divine support. Rosewood explained without hesitation. They had families, but they were also the ones who had been abandoned. That pain did not go away just because there was food on the table now. Ron said that even if the harvest was good, coming back would not guarantee a welcome. Lulu raised a darker fear that they could be rejected again. Soyan went further and warned they could even be sold as slaves this time. Rose would end the matter firmly. None of them wanted to return. The realization hit hard. He had missed something obvious in his optimism. Being rejected by your own family and coming back for acceptance was a cruelty he should have expected. Deep down, the orphan in him had always idealized parents. He projected that longing onto the others and made a serious mistake. Rose looked at him steadily. He said what none of them had dared to say. They all loved Almus. Almus froze, his heart twisting. Ron stepped forward, begging Almus to stay and keep leading them as he always had. Graham added that they were not related by blood, but that did not matter. Soyan said that was exactly why they loved him. Ron raised his voice to the others and asked for a show of hands about who wanted to return to their parents. There was silence. Ron then asked for a show of hands about who wanted to follow Almus. An immediate, thunderous response washed over the crowd, cheers, raised arms, and unwavering loyalty on every face. Overwhelmed, Almus tried again, asking whether anyone really wanted to go back, but no one budged, and they only shouted louder, throwing their voices behind him. He remembered when these same children cried themselves to sleep, calling for the parents who had abandoned them, and now they looked up to him instead. Tetra stepped forward and spoke for everyone. Their love for him was enough. Almost his eyes brimmed with tears. Soyan teased him about crying. Embarrassed, he turned away and rubbed his eyes. Then he faced them again, smiled through his emotions, said he understood, promised to remain their leader, and told them to keep following him. And a unified cry of agreement rang out. Something about their coordination struck him. It was too perfect, almost staged. He said he was suspicious. Soyan couldn't stop laughing and admitted he had seen through them, then looked confused and glanced around as Graham explained. Tetra had noticed he'd been acting unsettled lately. Ron proposed a plan to make him cry, to lift his spirits. And when he stammered in protest and tried to deflect, Rosewood immediately took the blame, and the two boys slipped into their usual banter. They bickered and passed the blame with over-the-top theatrics. Watching them, Almus's heart swelled. He watched the laughing faces around him, the family he had pieced together from fragments of broken pasts, and in that moment he knew he was truly fortunate.